All right. I'm back in action. What's going on, people? You might be able to tell I'm in a new room now. It's, I think, an improvement in a few ways. First of all, it doesn't have the vomit color walls, so that's good. I moved into a new place with my wife, so we live in a totally different part of town now, totally new flat, and now we have normal white walls. So this, I think, is going to be a major breakthrough for my streaming career. Much less hideous backdrop. Have my nice red curtains up. Anyway, it's been a while. I went on a little holiday. That was cool. Got some rest and relaxation, and I also, moved house, and that's always a bit stressful. It took us a few days to make that transition, and here I am getting ready for the new academic semester to start, but also trying to get my shit planned out so I can keep these streams going. So there are actually a few interesting bits of news to talk about since I haven't streamed in a little while. The one is, since I crossed the 1,000 subscriber threshold, it took a few weeks for them to review my account, but I'm now monetized, as they say. And one of the things that comes with that is the YouTube has this like function called super chats, so if you look at the public chat, you'll see a new little symbol that was not there before. It's like a money sign. And I don't know if any of you are silly enough or rich enough to ever want to do this, but basically what it is for those of you who are not, YouTube experts, you can basically pay to have your comment pinned to the top of the public chat so everyone will see it. I think I'm curious to see if anyone uses that. But anyway, I just thought I'd point that out, that that's there now. And I'm now also making like, $1 per video or something like that over the course of a year. So thanks, Edwin. It's okay. You can criticize me a little bit. I don't care. I have thick skin. What else? So tonight, in about 20 minutes, I'm going to be joined by Gio. By the way, do I sound okay? Is it a little echoey? I hope it's not too bad. I'm hoping to pimp out this room a little bit. Like, I'm going to get some sweet art in the background. I was thinking I might get a little chair right there, like a, nice looking, aesthetically pleasing, sophisticated, I don't know, like armchair or wing chair or something like that, and sit there like this, smoking my pipe, all sophisticated when I do these live streams or something like that. I don't know. I have some silly ideas. We'll see. Wow, I'm married. Yeah, of course I'm married. Look at me. Look how handsome I am. You think someone didn't scoop me up yet? Please. Yeah, AdSense changes lives. We'll see. That would be sweet. Get a swivel chair to own the libs. Yeah, maybe we'll see. In other news, I'm also booking up my other live streams for the next few weeks. And on Friday, I'm going to be talking with the author of, I don't know if any of you saw the little takedown article about accelerationism that was passed around recently. I saw some long threads in the ACK sphere, as they say, that were kind of engaging with it. There's a lot of, I think, dissatisfaction with the article or whatever. But then I also saw some people quote it and kind of endorse it. Like, I think I saw Michael James, who was on the show not too long ago. I think he shared it on Facebook with a positive, comment or something like that. So I saw that it was kind of attracting polarized responses. So I reached out to them and asked them if they wanted to ask the author if they wanted to come on here. And they said yes. And they're also going to bring a friend who edited the piece. And I actually didn't know this until they responded. But the person who wrote that article, the recent article, I should put a link. I don't even remember the title. But I'm just going to trust some of you heard about it or read it. It was on the website Cosmonaut. If you just Google like Cosmonaut accelerationism, I'm sure you'll find it. It was mostly critical, but it was, fairly thoughtful, I thought. Can you find the link and post it? I'm sure you can Google it easily. Anyway, I just thought that it'd be worth, I was curious about the people and thought I'd like to chat with them. So they're going to be joining me on here on Friday, actually, at this time. We're going to do a little conversation about that. And it was interesting because oh, right, this is what I was going to say before I forgot. They also, those people do a podcast called the Swampside Chats, and they're like legit hardcore kind of devout communists. And they do a little podcast, which what I thought was cool looking through their episodes is they do read a lot of reactionaries, and they're very interested in at least thinking about and reading and engaging with Nick Land and the Dark Enlightenment and a bunch of other reactionaries also. So to their credit, I think that's that's a rather bold step forward for the contemporary like left wing milieus. If you remember, like even 1 year ago when I first started even reading Moldbug and talking about it, that got me, that basically was like not allowed in even the relatively cool, relaxed left-wing circles that I was a part of at that time. So that's, I think, pretty cool. And that's kind of an interesting, I think, sign of how maybe perhaps, internet culture has kind of pried open a little bit the more narrow-minded norms of some left-wing activist circles that these people are, at least like willing to read and talk about. They're mostly critical. Like I was listening today to their podcast about the Dark Enlightenment, and it's very critical, but they're communists, whatever, that's fine. The fact that they're reading it and talking about it is, as I said, a pretty radical step forward if you compare that to kind of the baseline culture of like left-wing activist circles even about a year ago. So anyway, I commend that, and I think that's really cool. And the fact that they're willing to talk to me is also, pretty open-minded. So I'm curious to see. A lot of the people I've talked with in the past couple weeks, or the past few streams, I've spoken with a fair number of like pretty right-wing people, and so I'm happy to be talking again with like some proper, real, hardcore, traditional kind of communists. It'll be interesting, I think, to pick their brain. Yeah. So someone in the chat is saying that the anti-ACT article was basically the author stamping their feet and whining that UAC doesn't like some of what Marx says. Well, that's one way to put it, but I will, I think a conversation is a much more effective and productive way to, tease out like what they really think and what's really going on under the hood of, their perspective. So yeah, if you listen to their podcasts, they're definitely very thoughtful people who are willing to kind of like talk things out. So it'll be interesting. If you have any questions or comments about that anti-accelerationism article, send them my way and I can try to maybe mention them. Or obviously, as always, just join the chat and you can bring up your questions then. Guest on Sargon podcast when I don't know Sargon. I'm not really like socialized into YouTube circles, and my sense is that like to do that sort of thing, you kind of have to like make reaction videos and stuff like that. And I'm not going to start making videos like criticizing Sargon or praising Sargon or these other like YouTube figures. Just not my style. So I think for that reason, I don't know. I think maybe the big YouTubers might not really know about me or care about me for quite a while. We'll see though. I mean, I'd be happy to talk to any of those people. I just don't really care about like doing the social networking to like climb my way into their attention. So, right. So yeah, 15 minutes now, we'll have Geo, and then tomorrow at about this time, check back for to talk with these two people from the Cosmonaut blog and the Swampside Chats podcast. How similar is NRX to the alt-right? People in the chat, you can take that one. I guess I would say, in a nutshell, NRX is kind of like the more legit intellectual, maybe you could say, I don't know if you could say this, but I would think of it as kind of the more legit intellectual wing of kind of like the alt-right tendencies. So the alt-right kind of refers to like the much larger, in my view anyway, this is how I interpret it. I don't think any of these terms really have like very fixed meanings, but the way that I make sense of them anyway is that the alt-right kind of refers to the much larger umbrella of all kinds of actors who are basically outside of the conservative establishment, but energized in recent years over all kinds of things. So That would include online and offline types of phenomena. Many Trump supporters, even like people like like the Gavin McInnes, like Proud Boys. That's sort of all like the very larger umbrella. I would think of kind of that all of that as broadly what people have in mind when they talk about alt-right. But NRX is more like Moldbug and Nick Land. At least that's the way that I kind of think about it. That might not even be exactly right, but this is something that maybe we'll talk about with Geo. Maybe Geo knows better. He's commenting in the chat already. He says NRX is pretty much the handmaiden of the alt-right at this point. That'll be a good jumping off point for when he joins. We can pick apart what that means. All right, what else? So, right. So I guess I'll briefly talk about something real quick. Over the past couple weeks, kind of while I was, relaxing and kind of taking a break from doing all these live streams and stuff like that, I reached out to a few people privately, a few people that I know have been following the shows and kind of like what I do and read all my stuff and whatever. I reached out privately to a handful of people to kind of help to do a first round, a private round sort of building up a little bit of a modest crowdfunding kind of little war chest, because I'm starting to get a little bit of heat from the university. I've told some of you about this. I have an ongoing investigation. I'm actually not allowed to talk about it right now too much. I'm not going to like really respect those obligations. I will, tell all sooner or later, but it's kind of in a limbo space. So I'm not talking about it. I'm not talking about it right now. I just want to see where it goes. I want to feel out my strategic landscape a little bit more before I, do anything too rash. But basically, it's starting to become clear to me that my risks at the university and the workplace are starting to increase. So I figured, like, I really want to keep doing all of these things. So I figured it just makes a little bit of sense while it's summer and my time is relatively free. I wanted to basically, for the small number of people who have kind of offered to give me a little bit of money or whatever, to chip in for this sort of thing. I just thought I would do a little test run, a private run, and kind of just invite or welcome people to give if they felt so inclined. I really don't care. I'm not going to be putting any pressure on anyone. I'm not certainly not trying to get rich by like YouTube or whatever. But I have at least just opened up the interface for people who feel so inclined and have the money to spare and want, really like what I'm doing. If you want to, you can now throw a little bit of money my way. So I'm not pushing it too hard. You're not going to see like massive advertisements and crap like that. I'm not going to talk about it at the beginning and the end for like 20 minutes, like a lot of people do. I think like begging for money is really distasteful and I'm not really interested in doing it. This is actually the first time I'm just sharing with you that this is now open and available. If people have a few extra bucks and they really like what I'm doing, you're more than welcome to throw a little bit of money my way. But if you don't have that much money, please don't worry about it. I don't care. I'm not going to be asking too hard at all. And everyone can, if you like what I'm doing, you can enjoy it regardless. But basically, I mean, if you're interested, on my website, theotherlifenow.com, where I'm kind of doing all this stuff in one place, there's a little page. You can find it. It's just called support. And you can give in all the different ways that people like to give nowadays. You can do it through PayPal. You can give Bitcoin, Ether, whatever you want. Or of course, Patreon. I now have a little Patreon page. Like I said, I find like people who hawk that stuff too hard to be really distasteful, and I don't want to become one of those. But this is just a public service announcement letting you know that it's there. And big thanks to all the people who I reached out to privately who, who have offered in the past or wanted to do that. So that's now up and running. And actually, for what it's worth, I should say, I'm, really, really just flattered and very energized, I might add, I was quite surprised by how many people actually were quite happy and keen to give a few bucks. And so, yeah, I think I have something like 25 or 30 patrons already. So big thanks to those. And if you want to, go for it. But like I said, I don't need it to pay the bills. I don't need it to motivate what I'm doing. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing regardless. But given the risks and the strategic landscape seems to be shifting for me, I figured now would be a good time to just get all that stuff up and running, make it available so it's there, so that if, God forbid, the university really tries to something goes crazy and they really try to clamp down on me or fire me or something like that, then all the the interfaces will be there for people to help out in that type of financial crisis if it does occur to my to my livelihood from basically from doing all this stuff. Because basically the heat that I'm getting from the university is directly because of this stuff. I'll tell you more about it in a later stream for sure. But yeah, so you got to hedge your bets. You got to diversify your risks. What else do we got going in the chat here? Your mild Jacobite articles got you investigated. I've never written an article for Jacobite. Thank you very much. I'm not above Jacobite. I'm just saying I never have. And no, it's actually these live streams. I have I'll just talk about it for a little bit. Who cares? I mean, I have a disciplinary investigation open on me in the university. It literally says the documents I've been given literally says I'm not allowed to talk about the disciplinary investigation. And I mean, that's just not really an option for me. Like I talk about anything that's interesting that's going on in my life, especially if it's politically dubious. Like I'm gonna die talking about it. Yeah. So yeah. I'm in a later live stream. I'll definitely tell you more details, especially when I find out where it's going. Basically, I had a disciplinary investigation. It was just they asked me some questions, and there's an official proceeding. But it basically they literally cite specific lines that I've spoken in these live streams. They call the live stream my chat room. That says one of the charges against me is you said, quote, I'll tell you later, in your chat room. It sounds like AOL. It sounds like I run I have a little AOL subculture. I don't know if they know what the word live stream is. Anyway, yeah, I'm trying to be somewhat respectful to their process. Here's basically my principle and my strategy for how I'm dealing with it. If they are willing to be reasonable and sensible with me, I'm willing to be reasonable and sensible with them. So they had me come to this investigation, this disciplinary investigation, where they asked me a bunch of questions, a lot of which were quite ridiculous. But I was polite. I cooperated. I answered their questions. I was polite. I whatever. And I'm trusting and hoping that they see that there's no cause for concern and that everything I'm doing on the internet is consistent with my academic freedom. And I'm trusting that they're going to see it for what it is and they're going to drop the investigation. And for that reason, I'm showing respect by not divulging too much. I'm respecting their request for confidentiality because I'm not giving all the details. I'm respecting their request for confidentiality. And so basically I'm playing tit for tat. If they're respectful and reasonable, I'll be respectful and reasonable, and hopefully it'll just go away when they see there's no cause for disciplinary action. If, however, they escalate and they're unreasonable, and for instance, they try to punish me for things I've said on my totally free personal live stream, then I'm going to escalate also. And I'll, as I said, and as I might have said before, I don't think I think that's a battle that I would win. I don't think that, they have if they were to push it, if they were really to kind of try to punish me for speaking freely on the internet, I think I'm pretty confident that the power of balance is actually not in their favor, because I do now have a kind of up and running, totally independent internet platform. It's not with a massive audience at all, but it's enough of an audience that, if they do anything really unreasonable, a lot of people will find out about it real quickly. And we've already seen a bunch of examples where that happens, and it's a huge PR disaster for the university. And the person who's the subject of it actually comes out quite all right. So I should be very clear. I'm not a provocateur in the sense of I'm not a media whore. I'm not trying to provoke any type of publicity stunt. Now, that's what I'm trying to make clear. As I said, I'm being respectful of their process and hoping that it just goes away. But if it doesn't, I'm surely prepared to go to war in the public eye. And I think that I think it would probably be pretty fun. Anyway, that's that. So I've probably already said too much. But no, I haven't divulged any very bad details. So I think they wouldn't mind me surely I can tell people that I, vaguely am subject to an investigation of some kind. What should what I was going to say, there was something I was going to say, shit. It escaped me. Okay, I've blabbered enough. I think we will now begin to welcome Geo. Let me get the link, and I'll have to send it to him. I am. How does it sound? Is it echoey? Is the background more pleasing than it was in my old house? There we go. Invite people. Link. All right. 1 second. First, right. All right. So just sent a link to Geo. He should be joining us in a couple minutes. What else? What else should we talk about in the meantime? Well, I am about 1 year away now from having to decide whether I'm going to reapply for my visa. And UK, they make it really fucking hard to be an immigrant. It's like super expensive to increase your, every time you have to reapply, it's like more expensive. And it's really starting to piss me off because I don't, this country's not bad, but I don't love this country so much that I want to give all my fucking money just to being a citizen here. So if I want to stay longer and eventually become a citizen, this would be like beginning the process to be a citizen. I've been here for 5 years now. In a year, I'll have to decide whether I want to pay them mad money and basically start becoming a citizen, or do I just want to fucking leave this country? I'll tell you more about that later. Geo, what's up? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you loud and clear. What's going on, dude?
Good. Oh, not much, Just waiting for this conversation. So,
Cool. Well, thank you for joining me.
oh, the pleasure's mine. Well, I guess I should mark out a little bit now, as they say in wrestling. I'm a big fan of your work. I'm a big fan of what you do. I
Thank you.
think it was amazing. And of course, you're always going to get a certain amount of attention at universities nowadays, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah.
But I
Well,
think
thank you.
what you're doing is very important. So,
Oh man, I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. So tell me, if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about yourself. Well, actually, before I start asking you about yourself, how like anonymous are you? Are you very sensitive to that, or not that sensitive?
no, not sensitive at all. Like I don't do the I don't do the face reveal that much, but I'm very easy to find. Like I use my real name on my blog, so.
Oh yeah, okay. So let's just start with a few random questions. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I am 25.
Okay,
So yeah,
cool, cool. And what like part of the country are you in, or?
I'm in Ontario, but I'm specifically like in the Niagara region, like right near the U.S. border, like right near Niagara Falls, pretty much. So
Okay.
yeah.
And your kind of main vocation at you're a painter, is that right?
Yeah. Well, I'm writer painter, but I just recently, by recently I mean like in the spring, uh got my second MA, and now I'm just sort of doing the neat life till I apply to universities and in like the winter. So, but yeah, I'm mostly a writer and a painter. Yeah.
Okay, cool, cool. So what kind of gigs are you looking for in particular?
Oh, I always wanted to be a. Oh, what do you mean by gigs? You mean in academia or?
Like, what are you applying for? You mean?
Oh, I would apply. I want to apply to a PhD program, so I want to be at your level one day.
Oh, where I don't know if I would advise it, but I hear you, man. Whatever you want. I that's cool.
I know it's a grind, eh? Like I always have my doubts, obviously, especially in my position, but it is what it is.
Yeah, man. Whatever. I mean, there's lots of reasons to want to pursue further education, but there are also more and more reasons to not do it. I think,
Oh, you
but
man.
that's a whole big debate or conversation we could have if you want to. But I suspect that's not the most interesting stuff we could talk about. I do these live streams mostly to like escape talking about academia. So,
Maybe,
um,
yeah, maybe we'll chat about that in the DM sometime. Sure.
sure. So, okay, cool. We already have some interesting questions from the chat. One question is, what are your thoughts on Burden? I believe they're referring to Chris Burden. Do you like him?
You mean burden?
Well, Blue Horizons in the chat says, "What are your thoughts on my buddy Burden?" I'm assuming, unless there's some other Burden, I'm assuming that's Chris Burden. Do you have any thoughts or no?
Oh, the only burden I know is the visual artist burden.
There's a performance artist called Chris Burden. I assume that's who they're talking about. You just might not be that familiar with his work. There's actually a documentary on Netflix, or at least there was, which is quite good. I actually personally think the question was directed towards you, but I will just rudely start answering it myself.
No problem.
I think Chris Burden is actually really cool. Personally, he basically does. He's kind of in the tradition of like, doing crazy shit to your body. I don't know what the technical term would that be. Kind of like Marina Abramovich is in that tradition.
Oh, okay.
So like probably his most famous piece of work is he let someone shoot him with a gun once, and that was
Oh,
like,
that guy. Yeah,
yeah, that was
I know.
that was pretty early too. That was, I believe, it was like in the 80s, I think.
I think it was even like in the
It
70s.
might have been. It might have been even earlier. Yeah. So like pretty interesting dude. And if you watch the documentary about him, um, you definitely get the vibe that he's definitely like a legit, authentic kind of he's searching for something. He's like got a few screws loose and is really, passionately searching for something. And to me, that's kind of like my criterion for authentic art, for the authentic artist. Like, I don't have to like it, I don't have to understand it, but I'm always kind of sniffing out like, are you genuinely really trying to get after something that's real to you? And I feel like you can usually sniff that out pretty quickly, or at least I feel like I've usually have a pretty confident read, and he seems like the real deal in that. He had a really interesting long career of doing like really crazy shit to himself and putting himself in crazy situations. It seems like for like fairly authentic, artistically driven reasons. I thought the documentary showed him to be quite interesting, is my take.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like it reminds me of Byers and other beyond conceptual artists that people usually snicker at. Like I have a series on my blog. I think you saw it, called Monday Modern Art Madness, where I try to sort of have a bit more of a, how shall I put it, a bit more of a kinder spin on modern art, because usually in the circles I travel in, like what first of all, how to define modern art, it's a contentious issue, but usually the circles I travel in, it's like, oh, that's bad, that's destroying it's destroying beauty and things like that. And there's a critique there, but it almost reminds me of, I wrote this article for Logos Club about I don't know if you know anything about professional wrestling, but there's this strain of it called death match wrestling, where they hurl each other into light tubes and barbed wire and fire and things like that. And I tried to sort of uh, find some art within that, like, and I mentioned Bataille and things like that, and the limit, and whether it's pretentious or not, but no, I generally do find a value in that type of extreme feat of how not just the human body but the human psyche can immerse themselves into art. And Abramovic, yeah, is another example of that. I know the Paul Joseph Watson crowd thought she's like some globalist high priestess or whatever, but
Mm. Interesting. So you're like more of a traditionalist, but you have an open mind towards more modern conceptual art.
yeah, I'm a bit of a freak in that regard. It's like how I'm would be considered like a trad cath, but I've studied Buddhism and Hinduism for many years and things like that. It's so, yeah, I definitely, well, I started off in abstract painting. I think that's what I was really fascinated with a lot of the artists that came about right before the New York School, artists like Mark Toby, who were really trying, this is like before the New Age stuff. These guys were the original, the Northwestern painters. And I was really fascinated with that stuff. And I was fascinated with more traditional art and how that was being appropriated by modern artists in the New York School and things like that. So, yeah, I definitely don't I guess you could call it a Philistine mentality. Like, again, the Paul Joseph Watson thing about how modern art is trash. And to me, it's just it's so distasteful to just cast aside um, the innovation in art. And another thing, even if you hate it, I think that you have to pay attention to these things as a barometer towards which the streams in which culture are heading towards. And I think even just in a purely negative sense, modern art can give us a really good picture of what is in vogue. And so I think this whole like right wing attitude towards like non-representational forms of art, I think is sort of misguided in so many ways. And of course, I get a lot of flack for that, but
Okay, interesting. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about your kind of placement in like the larger kind of like weird intellectual Twitter space.
Okay. Okay, let me tell you about maybe I'll tell you about where I started and like what I'm not. Okay. So I started off I wrote this essay in a grad course for a critical theory grad course, and it mentioned an artist that I've done quite a bit of work on, right, in terms of writing. The visual artist, his name is Nobody TM, and he became quite. I say he, but it's a whole team, but he's one of the last guys that does genuine video art, and so and he became popular on 4chan and places like that. Especially this one video, it's called You. That's the most popular Nobody TM video, where he sort of edits. That's what he calls them, edits, where they're sort of like a polysemous multiplicities of forms. And actually, my essay is like right on the homepage there. And so I wrote this essay where I mentioned Nobody TM in an academic setting, which is like kind of crazy on its own. And then I started writing for West Coast Reactionaries, and then I started eventually writing for Thermidor magazine, which recently became no more. But
Okay. Okay. Well, so hang on. Let's back up a little bit. So so
right.
is Nobody TM, are they like reactionary, or like what was the link between that and
Well,
reactionary?
yeah, it's basically what I would call alchemical metaphysical style, a style of video art, which the first crop of videos are like quite like on the nose and reactionary in terms of the political message that it's really trying to expose like quote unquote the degeneracy of modernity and things like that. But as time went on, Nobody TM became much more, I would say, some people would say Gnostic, but some others would say Neoplatonic in terms of trying to elucidate the human condition through the technological apparatus. And in a way, like I pointed this out in my essay, um, in a way, Nobody TM tries to subvert the machinations of techno, post-industrial, postmodern society by using the very means of the technocratic world we live in, which is like video and audio and visual technology.
Could you tell me more about like who is it?
Not really, because the whole point of Nobody TM is that it's anonymous. It's nobody trademark.
But are they like recognized in the art world now or no?
Oh no, God no! This is like really underground stuff. This is like not
But fairly big in the underground, I guess, if you're
Oh
talking about
yeah,
them.
yeah. People I've talked to, very quite popular among reactionary circles, especially because like back in the day, people started sharing it on like 4chan, and then Nobody TM as a project became quite big, and that
Okay.
whole style really influenced a lot of more popular mediums. Like you could even say that I guess you could say the Sam Hyde style of video editing was even partially influenced by Nobody TM, or at least there's speculations. But
Interesting. Okay. I've never really heard much about it. So, okay, so that got you into like reactionary circles?
Yeah, that got me writing for a number of places till where I eventually landed on writing full time for Thermidor magazine.
So
So,
what's their story? What's the story of Thermidor?
well, Thermidor started off right after West Coast Reactionaries, which was run by Adam Wallace. And of course, Adam Wallace was fairly big in reactionary circles. He was even on this Channel 4. I don't want to call it documentary because it was more of like a hit job. But so West Coast Reactionaries closed up shop, and Thermidor magazine was started by number of the authors of West Coast, and then it became sort of big to the point where we even kind of eclipsed like Social Matter and places like that. And so it was really just a collective of writers who wanted to, and still do, sort of become I know this sounds like totally pretentious. I'm very sorry for this, but wanted to become the intellectual vanguard of sort of the under what are you gonna call it, underground right, dissident right, or whatnot. But writers that weren't necessarily affiliated with the whole alternative right,
Yeah,
race realist stuff. You know what I mean? Because
sure.
I was always very cautious of that myself personally. Like I don't consider myself among the alt right, or well, we like to call them Wignats, but as a Wigger nationalist. But so anyways, we wanted to pump out articles that were very sort of cerebral, but also focused on things that NRX usually doesn't focus on, like arts and culture and trends in intellectual spheres and things like that. So
Okay,
that's
yeah.
where,
So
yeah,
I think I listened to like a podcast with Kantbot on Thermidor once.
yeah,
So what was the fate of Thermidor? You said that it kind of it's now defunct, or where is it at?
yeah. Well, a lot of us authors are going to migrate to another site. This is a little insider baseball. And so the
Oh,
archive, so a partial archive will be up, and of course I have all my articles saved, so I might publish them on myself. But I the founder of Thermidor, PT Carlo, sort of wanted to pack it in, sort of I guess you could say we've said everything we've said, and things like that. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm rambling. I'm sorry about
no,
that.
no, no.
Well,
I was
I
just
think
curious. I'm always just
yeah, I
curious
think
about the backstories.
oh, no problem. I think to me what it signifies is sort of a greater trend on the right as a whole, at least in the internet right, which I think we can talk about a bit, which is sort of after the momentum of Trump, after the deflation of a common goal. I noticed that, apart from like people obviously getting banned off of social media, it seems that we're just scattered into our little groups and we're everywhere, and like people are going away, and there's no there's no real cohesion anymore. There's no like unifying force that energizes us, at least from my estimation. And that's why I don't know if you saw this foundation funded piece about the reactionary YouTubers, and they list all the alt light people. And to me, the reality of it is that it's not, for all the leftist listing, it's not as coherent or organized as people like to make it out.
Uh-huh.
Even YouTubers, like YouTube is the biggest game in town, but still, it's like, what do those people do with their Patreon dollars? It's about, you can't rely on people to have sort of grassroots funding networks, which I I think is a shame. I think that if we, like, speaking as a person, I consider myself on the right, whether people can contend with that or not. I think that it's a shame that we don't put our principles where our mouth is, and to actually um, organize and to use certain tools of the new left, which is a big thing that I've been harping on, is that you need to, discover tactics that are effective, whether it be localism or whatnot. And I think that just, posting memes on the internet is kind of, such an oversaturated and useless, not useless, but consciousness raising can only get you to a certain plateau. And other than that, but anyways, I'm rambling right now.
No,
So.
that's okay. No, it's all good. It's interesting. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about what are your larger politics? So you just said, for instance, that you're interested in, political change in some sense. I'd be curious to know, like, what, where your kind of policy preferences play out, and your kind of model for like what kind of social change you are interested in.
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I think, like, if I had like specific things, I'd sound like a suit, but it's very hard to pinpoint things apart from just a general sentiment of cultural change. Like, I think I said to you, like, I'm very much of a traditionalist mindset in terms of cultural norms and things like that. I think that in terms of specific policy, it's very hard to talk about those hands-on things, because it depends on the social milieu that we're operating from. And I think in America it's sort of different. In Canada, it's, I'm being a Canadian, being a Leaf, it's sort of like can be very what's the term, blackpilling sometimes. So there's no real specifics that I can really give, but generally I am more of the traditionalist metaphysical mindset in terms of how modernity has sort of warped our perception of what matters in life and what really constitutes authentic being, put it that way.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I get you. I know exactly. I can. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think I know what you mean. And you're a Catholic, yeah?
Yeah, I'm a Catholic. For many years I was like a New Ager, but I've landed back to my original Catholic faith. Yes.
So there was actually a question. I don't know, like, how deep into like Catholic theology you are, but there was a question to that effect earlier in the chat, and it was Brian Nichols wants to know if you would like to comment on sola fide or sola fide. I forget if you pronounce the e at the end, and basically the distinction between works-based and faith-based Christianity. Sola fide means
Okay.
faith alone.
I think that um, I'm definitely, one of the most attractive things to the Catholic faith, at least in my mind, is the doctrine of faith and works. I think that if we are going, and I don't mean to offend Protestants, right? I know it's a funny meme that we bomb on Protestants, but I think that faith alone sort of doesn't play well to God's commanding of our responsibility to not just the divine, but also each other and to creation itself. I think faith and good works, to me at least, go hand in hand for very practical reasons in terms of the faith. Yeah.
So you don't believe in, as a Catholic, naturally, you don't believe in faith alone, is your short answer.
Yeah, more or less. I don't believe in the sort of like, non-denom faith alone sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a little bit more of, I think I'm at a point where I would, if someone asked me, I would just say straight up, I am a Catholic. I guess I am. I mean, I do go to church, and I go to confession now, and I'm in good standing in the church. For me, it's a little bit easier because I was raised Catholic and I was confirmed and everything. So I kind of fell away from the church for 17 years, was just a kind of standard, like, modern rationalist atheist type of, rootless cosmopolitan. And
don't use that term. Oh my God.
why?
Well, you know that the Soviets use it as a term for Jews, right? So.
Oh, really? Well, I mean, I was identifying with it, so I wasn't like putting anyone down.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that about you. I thought that you were still, at least some people have told me that you're still like, oh, he's only putting Catholic on his Twitter as an ironic thing, right? But I go, I don't know about that, because you seem very open-minded when it comes to religion and things like that.
Well, people always have their interpretations. That's fine, but people can just ask me. I'll tell them straight up, which is what I'm telling you right now, which is that I was like a normal kind of standard, like, urban hipster atheist person for 17 years after. Like, as soon as I got confirmed, I was like, fuck this shit. I'm not going not going to church anymore. This shit is bullshit. But then as I've gotten older, now in the past like probably 4 years, I've really started kind of coming around to it, and only I went to confession for the first time about 5 months ago, I think.
Wow.
But I did it. But I did it, very conscientiously and in good faith. But I'm also, there are lots of questions about theology that I haven't fully resolved to myself. And I am, basically like I'm an intellectual, like I do believe in, like I'm not going to say anything or swear allegiance to anything or do anything unless I can, justify it in my own tongue and
Exactly. Yeah.
genuinely and sincerely on like a, hardcore intellectual rational basis. And so there are definitely some parts of the kind of Catholic theology that are just still question marks for me. Like I haven't fully integrated it into a worldview that I'm able to kind of like understand completely and defend completely. But I think that that's just like a feature of, the mysteries of life and grappling with the mysteries of life. Like I think probably, a genuine religious life probably involves this kind of grappling, all the time. And so I've come to basically accept that I have questions and I have some uncertainties, but I feel sufficiently convinced of the necessity and the goodness and the truth of the Catholic worldview and the Catholic life. I've become sufficiently convinced that it is kind of the best available way for me to organize my own priorities and lifestyle. I've become convinced that that is true. And so I'm acting on that. And to that degree, so I am in good standing. I go to confession and I go to mass, and I don't know if I could. So in that sense, like my Twitter bio used to say like secular Catholic because I was like very into this stuff and kind of leaning back towards it, but was much more distant from it. But now I'm kind of like, if people ask me, I think I'll drop the secular, and I think I am a proper Catholic. But I'm not. What I try to stress to people though is that like I'm not actually any different than I was a year ago in my basic kind of like intellectual rational, like my commitment to like rationality has not changed at all. Like I'm not like all of a sudden adopting superstitions or something like that. Like I still see the world as, I think, as coldly and analytically as I ever have. I just think it seems to me that religion is like a true wager that I would defend, but that I'm still just, kind of exploring and figuring out. But I think that's always true with anything, with any ethical position that one adopts in life. Like it's always an ongoing kind of reflection with some holes and puzzles in it at all times. So I think that's just a rational and realistic way to think about like any ethical kind of worldview. But I'm ranting now.
No, I'm what you've just said. I'm 100% of the same mind on. I think that when you really look at the lives of the saints, being plagued with doubt is par for the
Mm.
course. And I
Mm.
think that people. It's very weird. There's this YouTuber I used to watch, but I won't mention because it'll get me into trouble. Whatever. That said, that said that it's very curious how in certain places, especially in North America and in Europe, nowadays it's sort of like the roles have reversed. Like now, if you are committed to your faith, then people look at you like you're weird. Like you perform private rituals and things like that, and or you're not of a sound, analytic, and rational mind because you know it's funny because we still sort of live in the age of reason, but now we've crossed over into the age of information. And I think there's a term, there's a term like information theorists use about tech overload, where it's no longer about reason in terms of what the philosophers would call inner contemplation, but now it's almost as if logic and reason have become fully reified within a context of materialist, highly technical society, and people like Spangler and that talk about this. And I think that nowadays it's sort of permeated people's views of anything that's outside of that framework, especially religion. People they sort of give you a semi dirty look if you confess your faith and that you fully believe in something that is by definition outside of the norm in terms of the material. And so it's very curious because it was not long ago, not even a few decades ago, where the opposite was true, especially in America, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with all of that, I think. I mean, I think it makes sense that there's a kind of pivoting back towards religion right now because of information overload. like you realize at a certain point you realize like in like the earlier stages of modernity when the spigots of information were only beginning to kind of like trickle out. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you could kind of have all these fantasies about, oh man, this is awesome. The human mind is going to, you know, manage and process all of this information and all to our greater glory. You know, like the encyclopedists, you know, of like the 18th century or
Yes,
whatever. You know, like these,
Diderot and all that.
like
Yeah.
yeah, like these motherfuckers actually thought they could like write down everything that we knew. You know, that sort of thing. Like of course, in that kind of early modern moment, of course, human beings are going to get arrogant and proud and get like so kind of excited by the prospects of what, you know, using technology and rationalism can do for us. You know, the delights and the utility that can be garnered from that kind of early modern um, unleashing of the information spigots. Well, I completely understand how people could think like, oh yeah, we can just kick out from under us that ladder of like religious value girding, because it was just, you know, it seemed semi manageable at that time because the spigots weren't, you know, like a fire hose yet. And now in the 21st century, when we're in this kind of like hyper accelerationist kind of like moment, and it's increasingly clear to everyone that there's way too much information for anyone to process, and the information itself is being, you know, revolutionized and increased and changed at a
Oh,
rate of
cut out there.
at a rate of change that is just completely inhuman at a completely inhuman scale. Well, guess what? Like rational principles just no longer function as like guides. I mean, it's not that they no longer function. Of course, they still have like an important role, and obviously, but for the actual like human being, for the individual human being, it's like increasingly unwieldy to try to parse the current social and political situation through like rational, pragmatic kind of like calculations. And so I think it makes perfect sense that you know, people are realizing like one always is kind of relying on like something beyond or beneath rationality. Like there's always some sort of like extra rational framework that we use to solve our like rational aporias. And that probably has always been the case, but in like the early modern period, people could kind of trick themselves into imagining that there's like no extra rational bedrock that's actually doing a lot of the mental and behavioral work. But now that our rational tools have been just exploded by a fire hose of excessive information, now we have to kind of like, people are becoming more explicit and they're willing to bite the bullet and say, yeah, okay, we're all religious now.
That's very interesting, and there's so many things I want to say to that because I noticed with your work, especially, there's sort of the sense that as we accelerate in this sort of like Virilio-esque speed of information technology, that in a way we're finding interesting ways to go through the side doors and find our way back to God, you know. And I think that to view reason as this very specific thing, which, you know, I've mentioned I mentioned my sort of how shall I call it, sympathies with certain forms of critical theory. Like for example, in post-colonialism, they talk about how that sort of hyper rational, objective and forward focusing mentality is a product of a certain culture in a certain post enlightenment, you know, Anglo-Saxon view of things that wasn't necessarily shared among, you know, the Slavic peoples or people like me, the Mediterraneans, right? So I think that that critique is fair because that Anglo-Saxon mentality, and maybe it's not necessarily Anglo-Saxon because now it's with globalization, it's the world that must conform to this standard. But that's sort of hyper, uh, how shall I say, pragmatist, utilitarian, rational minded, forward marching mentality is sort of becoming jammed up with the limitations of the very techno information systems that those civilizations created. And I think nowadays, we've become accustomed to metaphors that are very easily accessible that strike as metaphysical when it comes to the internet and the information age. For example, any first year philosophy class, when you talk about Plato, the students immediately get it because it's like, oh, that's like the Matrix, right? And so we have these sort of sci-fi quasi-metaphysical metaphors that people are employing. But also, I think when it comes to information and technology, I think that there's an uncertainty of being that the early proponents of this world really didn't see coming. Like there was a moment in the 90s when you had people, the Terence McKenna's of the world would talk about how the internet would become this great tool of psychedelia, and psychedelia meaning mind expanding. But really, it's almost as if we can only expand in a certain direction. And if anything, I would argue, and I know, it's a bit of hypocrisy because I use the internet every day, but I would argue that if anything, the super information technology that we use on a daily basis has almost deadened us and deadened our senses to a lot of different things that came natural not even 30 years ago to people. And I think that as technology becomes more centralized, as information becomes this deluge that people above us are desperately trying to have control over, I think that people are more confused and sort of lost in their own sense of being more than ever. And there's of course always these avenues of different thought, but then it's like you have to control them, and then it's like one thing leads to another. And anyways, yeah, I'm ranting here, but
No, no, that's all interesting though. Like I would pick up on one of the things you said by adding that, I think one of the reasons why the internet has not been this kind of like emancipatory phenomenon that a lot of people imagined it could be is in some part because of mundane, kind of profane, secular rationalism, in the sense that like the internet, it really is this kind of like just magnificent, extraordinary, weird, wide open kind of like it really is like in its nature a kind of mystical interface with
yes,
an amount of information and communication that we've never had before in the history of the world. And so it's actually this like wide open, unpredictable, just incommensurably large, open, wild, wild west. And yet, for the overwhelming majority of people who log onto it on a daily basis, they use it for like really mundane, fairly controlled, kind of like institutionally and commercially manipulated
yeah,
pathways.
yeah, yeah.
And if you think about like why is that? Like, how is it that people are herded so effectively into like really repetitive, mundane, kind of like behavioral pathways on the internet that they mostly don't like, and that probably a lot of research shows has like very deleterious effects on their life. And it's very, you make a very strong case that the way most people use the internet is counter to what they would optimally want out of life. Why is that? If you really kind of drill down into like what are the psychological kind of correlates of that, it's kind of because people are like contemporary, rational, secular normies. They're like
yes, yes.
they're like they're unable to connect with this like mystical interface that is actually an explosively unconstrained canvas for them to like link up with the infosphere in like the wildest variety of unpredictable, unconstrained ways. Like, and why is it? It's because they're thinking like, okay, what's most like rationally sensible for me to do today? Well, I like my friends. All my friends are on Facebook. I should log into Facebook. It just makes most sense. It's more efficient to log into Facebook because all my friends are there. It's these like very mundane kind of like rational, like rational calculations that cause all of these people to be like herded into these very, very narrow, soul-sucking behaviors. And so, yeah, that's just kind of an interesting thing, I think, to reflect on, that like modern rational secularism of like the typical kind of dead behind the eyes bug man is
Yes.
like the problem there is to a large extent, it is like mundane rational secularism, I think.
The inauthenticity of it. Yeah. Oh man. Oh, this is a fire chat right now. I would say that, okay, and I'm saying this as an artist who uses 100% traditional media. Well, I don't know if acrylic is traditional media, but I don't use a lot of digital things. But let me say that the underground, um, subaltern and subterranean sonic sphere of the internet, to me, is one of the biggest potential artistic creations within, I would say, since the Van Eyck's discovered oil painting. I truly believe that. I think that there is a metaphysic, and I know this sounds crazy, okay, what I'm about to say, but
Go for it, man. Go for it. Riff, dude.
I was talking about this with a friend the other day. There's an underlying metaphysics, I think, to the internet in terms of more than ever before, and you can see this if you're very engaged on Twitter. Ironically enough, because we all know the bed bugs that crawl in the depths of Twitter. I think that when it comes to hyperreality, I think that there is a sense where if you can think it, if you can promote it, and I know this sounds like this stupid, like positive affirmation stuff, but even in the negative sense, when enough people sort of quote unquote meme something into actuality, it's almost as if you can see in real time that, and people like to call this the post truth era, whatever, that if some people believe it to be true, eventually things will manifest in a sense into actuality. And I think that in the
Yeah,
internet,
it's hyperstition also
yes,
in the accelerationist kind of like framework.
yeah, exactly. I think that, to use a Deleuzian sort of metaphor, even if the vast majority of the internet is being reterritorialized along the aberration path of, like, this mega corporation controls this aspect and most people go to Google and Facebook and whatnot, I think that when you do really look for the lines of flight in the internet, I think that this sort of negative feedback loops and these aspects of hyperreality that manifest itself over time, I think that it's very curiously similar to metaphysics in a lot of ways. And I think that most people don't really have the sense to contemplate just how important a piece of technology like the internet is in terms of creation on a artistic and metaphysical and a political level. I mean, we all know about the politics of it, how people talk about this group is radicalizing people, or this, the memes led to Trump. Whether or not that's true, that's a debate, right? But I think that people now more than ever in some ways are starting to realize this potential, because we see it every day. We see, a trend of a meme goes up on the internet and becomes viral, and then, it's almost like within an instant something in, in real life and meat space manifests itself. So yeah, that would be my take on it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like if rightly understood in some sense, connecting to the internet today is you could actually understand it. I don't know if this, like I said, I'm not like a good Catholic. I don't know if this is like heretical or what, but I think connecting to the internet today, you could make the argument that it's the closest you can get to God in some sense, because
Interesting.
if God is that which knows all, and you know, especially if you think about like how AI is approaching the possibility of non-human super intelligent forms of super intelligence that might become recursive and self-improving, and if you buy this kind of whole narrative about the possibility of a super intelligence takeoff scenario, then whatever that agent is, that like super intelligent agent at the end of the recursive process of that explosive singularity process, like that, whatever that highest form of intelligence is at the end of that theoretical process, I don't see how that would be any different than what the religious traditions think of as God. And if that is true, then the internet as kind of the best kind of material physical instantiation of the current frontier of, you know, super intelligent, you know, information processes kind of like coagulating in a loosely, you know, aggregating format. If the internet is like the closest thing we have to like a plug or like a hookup nexus for us to kind of lock in mentally into this, you know, this like increasing, accelerating infosphere, then it kind of stands to reason that the internet today is like the most powerful kind of portal that man has ever kind of invented or developed, that actually allows you to kind of get as close to omniscience as possible. And if omniscience is God, then in some sense, the going onto the internet, it really can be seen as this like highly powerful kind of nearness to God. And then like Facebook would be like the devil, basically.
It's an axis mundi, in other words. Well, okay, first of all, that's very, very heretical. Okay, let me just
Sorry,
but
it's just the
no problem.
hypothesis. It's just the hypothesis.
I think, okay, to you know, sort of put away my Catholic hat for a minute. Um I think that's a very interesting idea. Let me just be very, upfront. I'm still somewhat critical of accelerationism in
Mm,
terms of the way it's formulated, like especially transhumanism. I think that the way it's formulated in the mainstream, I think, is very like Whiggish and linear, and they don't account for anti-fragile events, especially like the, you know, the corporate funded techno capital Ray Kurzweil types. But bracketing my criticism, I think that's a very interesting idea, and it's a very almost like strikingly plausible idea. The way you've especially laid it out, I was reading this article from this blog. I think it's called "Towards an Illuminated Accelerationism." I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's about the accelerate manifesto and all that stuff.
mhm.
And you know, to me, a lot of the ideas of left acceleration are very interesting. I wouldn't consider myself like personally an accelerationist like the Nick Land sort of right excel stuff, because I am kind of becoming more critical of capitalism and things like that. You
Mm.
know, like years ago I used to be like an ANCAP, and now I shudder the thought of that. You know, but yeah, I think it's very interesting what you've said, and I think that there's a plausibility that humans, through the practice of various techniques, can, in a way, if there's a shift in consciousness, you know, as buzzworded new agey as that sounds, I think that we can, in a way, consider techniques as a form of spiritual practice. Now, whether that's heretical or not, because when you think of it, uh, I was watching this video by this anarcho primitivist who came under fire recently. His name is, I think, Derek Jensen. He came
Mm.
under fire because of the whole transgender thing. But he had this video on YouTube where I was watching it. It struck me deeply, where he's talking about how when you look at things like art and poetry, and I guess, you know, Heidegger had a similar view. When you look at these things, they come natural to us, but yet in and of themselves, they are a form of technology, even though the way secular, sort of globalized, post-industrial society doesn't really give credibility to these subjective things like art and poetry, and you know, what things that you know, that book Seeing Like a State, where it talks about Métis practices and things like that. We
Mhm.
don't really give credence to these traditional and subjective ways of viewing being, but yet there, I would argue that art is just as much a technology as any sort of engineering or coding and things like that. But
Oh
yet
yeah,
we
definitely.
don't consider it such. But anyways, yeah, go ahead. I'm rambling.
Oh yeah, no, no, definitely. And all of the kind of like traditional Catholic, the accoutrements of the Catholic Mass, for instance. I mean, those are technologies. Those are technologies, right? They're social technologies
Oh
that
yeah, exactly.
that are kind of like organized to bring people nearer to God in some sense. So, I mean, I don't think it's too outrageous to think of the internet rightly understood in the right kind of framework as potentially being some sort of portal to God.
Right. And I think that when it comes to the ephemeralness of the internet, there's a lot of sort of tricky, shall we call them Zen moments there, where a thread can disappear, but the ideas live on, and there's sort of a transference between people that we've never imagined before. Like for example, um, me, just me experiencing you sending me a link to a live stream in real time while you're talking to other people throughout who God knows where, saying, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna send Geo a link." When you really sit down and contemplate it, it's almost as if that in itself is a metaphysical act on par with extreme meditative practices, but yet it's mediated by this very rationalist, modern world sort of device. But for
Yeah,
example,
definitely.
but yeah, like for example, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but a lot of my art has been about penetrating these various, I would say, enigmatic or esoteric spaces, in particular on the political right, which the art world, the professional art world, would never touch with a 10-foot pole. I think, like for example, I do a lot of paintings with memes. Whether that's like cheap or crass or whatever. But to me, I think to use the style of modern abstract expressionism towards meme culture, it's almost as if, in my mind at least, I'm trying to take something that's very ephemeral and impermanent and always changing and sort of, pluck that and lift that into a state of artistic stasis, whether or not that's a failure. And I would argue all great art, in a sense, is a failure at the end of the day, because we're trying to achieve an ideal that we are almost physically incapable of achieving. At least that's my, romantic, flowery picture of being an artist. But yeah, so
Oh yeah, so that reminds me. Something I wanted to ask you is, as someone who's, you're a young person who's, pursuing a career in art, do you not get nervous about all of your kind of right wing ideas because the art world is so notoriously left wing? Are you afraid that's going
um
to be a problem for you, or how do you think about that?
well, see, I don't know. I've almost been, when it comes to like me trying to pursue academia, I've almost been spoiled because I went to like a very open-minded university where I didn't I received some pushback, but I wrote this thing about, young people trying to make it in university, about like how it's very about your attitude and your personality. But no, I know for a fact that like if I first of all, my style of art, like I mostly do landscapes when I'm not doing abstract stuff. Just by the nature of it, I know for a fact that the professional art world, if by some miracle they ever give me any attention, it would be like to vilify me, like, oh, this crazy right wing artist is, making a mockery of things, right? But I think that we have to approach things in a general sense through really trying to push back and trying to march through the institutions, but also setting up, the whole, not that I'm a mold buggian, but like the whole mold bug idea of alternative institutions and things like that. But no, yeah, I mean it does worry me, especially in academia and the art world and things like that. Like I know I would never set foot in an art school, like oh my god, but I think that if more people are courageous enough to truly commit to their principles and to not hide under being an anon, then I think that there can be maybe not a critical mass, but in sort of these fugitive micro minoritarian instances of there being people who pop up. And there's even academics who are considered quote unquote on the right, who reached accolades like Adrian Vermeule and people like that. And I think what you're doing is even an example of that. Not that you're uh, not that you're a right winger, but I think what you're doing in terms of breaking the orthodoxy, because there's not very many people like, and this is my perception, of course, people can refute me on this, but there's not many people, like, as you've said, in leftist activist circles or in academia, that are willing to engage with these ideas. Like, for example, there's, God, how many sort of like mainstream lib coffee table books about the rise of the alt right and the rise of Trump, and all these academics that want to like really invest in the zeitgeist, right? But do you know how many of them actually talked to genuine people on the quote unquote alt right? Do you know how many? One. That what was her name? It was her name Nagel.
Oh, Angela Nagel.
Yeah, her, and she what is she got, bully sided off of Twitter, right? So I think that, it's like when I went through, and hopefully I still continue on, but when I went through university, it's like, I was presented with a choice. It's like, do I become embittered by the fact that most people don't agree with me, or do I truly try to humble myself to where I can talk to people and find possible points of connection? Because I'm ranting now, but let me just
No,
say,
go for it. Yeah.
this is one thing that I'm very critical of right wingers in the mainstream. I'm very critical of the Jordan Petersons and the quote unquote intellectual dark web people who already have tenure. Um, I I'm very critical of this attitude that a lot of people that especially have the Patreon dollars, of their attitude when it comes to people not necessarily on the right, but even like the quote unquote woke centrists. I'm very critical of this attitude where they're, you know oh no, if you're a person that's on the right, look at these crazy people, never go into the university, never try to have any sort of scholarly legitimacy. And it's hard enough, like, as it's hard enough, quote unquote, making it in academia to begin with, right? But the point that a lot of my work has been focused on is to sort of refute that and say that a lot of those cases are highly exaggerated. B, a lot of those people, and let me, name names, but you have like the Lindsay Shepherd case where uh, a lot of these people, they have a tendency to invite trouble, and I guess that's a fair assessment. I'm trying to, sugarcoat it, but let's face it, a lot of these cases where people are persecuted, they're inviting trouble. Um, C, I would argue it's the programs that you pick. And
Mhm.
in my experience, certain humanities programs are more favorable or forgiving than others. Like, there's a whole litany of things that you can contemplate besides, having the Philistine route and saying that, oh no, never go into the art world, never go into academia, just become a YouTuber like me. And sorry, I get very impassioned about this because I
No,
feel
I hear you. I actually agree with a lot of that. I think, I haven't gone on about this too much because it's easy for me to talk about this stuff because I am in a relatively secure position. So
right.
for that reason, I don't, preach about it. But I've often thought that, I mean, there's no doubt, I should say at the beginning, there's no doubt that academia is a fairly hostile place if you're like a seriously, strong conservative.
Right.
It's going to be, there are going to be unique kind of challenges and social roadblocks to fitting in
People will look at you. People will look at you with a more critical eye. Yeah.
and to succeeding, and there'll be challenges for sure, no doubt, and a large number of minor discomforts that do add up, and for sure. But I've long thought now for a while that all of the kind of right wing people who are really smart on the internet, who are really tightly anonymous, and they won't show their face, they won't show anything about themselves, because they think that if they do, their chances of having any position in any kind of like legitimate institutionalized space.
Or even
I,
corporations and
so when I say legitimate, that's in scare quotes. Like
yeah.
I have nothing but disrespect for like what counts as legitimated and what's institutionalized or whatever.
Oh yeah.
But like a lot of people do want that or whatever. So all I'm getting at is that I've long thought that people, basically, I think a lot of people on the right do overestimate the punishment,
Persecution. Yeah.
the punishment that they would receive. And so that's why I'm kind of interested in, I'm interested to hear what you just said, and I really appreciate your courage in a sense. And I
Oh,
feel, but yeah, but if I hear you correctly, it's not even necessarily courage. It's partially that for sure, but it's also just I think you have a reading of the actual strategic landscape that is more accurate than a lot of like the more paranoid anons. Because I think you're absolutely right. Like there are ways that you can play it. There are ways you can be a fairly reactionary person and
Oh yeah,
still
especially
like carve
anti-liberals. My
out a
God.
niche for yourself.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I hope I
Yeah.
wasn't. No, but especially anti-liberalism, like that's such a rich field that you can really, dive nose deep in. But I will stress, okay, one thing I would warn anyone listening, I would say that certain ideas, just like no matter how you present it, no matter what, and I see a lot of these people like among the Richard Spencer circles, like trying to appropriate critical theory language. No matter how much jargon you use, there's certain ideas that, like white nationalism, that unfortunately will never, no academic will ever touch that shit with a 10-foot pole. You know what I mean? And I think that you have to pick and choose what you truly value, and like
Yeah,
I
but
don't know.
that's true on the left too. Like there are certain
Oh yeah, it's God.
like
Yeah, you're right.
left wingers, like radical left wingers also kind of have to bite their tongue in many cases in mainstream institutions. So I mean there's definitely a left wing, like the mean is like much farther left, of course. But having to bite your tongue in institutionalized context, that's like a really, really strong and quite repressive reality for anyone on any part of the ideological spectrum, actually.
Like, do you mean in terms of like people who are genuine Marxists having to sort of go along with the Paul stuff, or what?
Well, what I'm kind of getting at is that it's almost non-ideological in that success in any mainstream institution requires a whole lot of lying about many things that has nothing to do with left or right. So like if you're a radical leftist and you're a professor or whatever, it's certainly more hospitable to you kind of saying what you think in the classroom or whatever, or in your publications. Like there's no doubt about that.
Right.
But even if you're no matter who you are on a daily basis, like in the faculty meetings that you go to, in the administrative things that you have to do, you're constantly biting your tongue because you're constantly confronting things that make no sense and are really stupid. But you have to,
Yeah.
but you have to say, "Oh, this is really good. I really care about this. I'm going to help do this." And it's like all of mainstream institutional life is this like really oppressive charade in which no one is ever saying what they really think and feel, and
Yeah.
and
Yes.
I think that's true whether you're on the left or the right. So it's
Oh
like,
yeah, you have to eat shit. Like, that's the reality of it. You have to like sort of, and I had a very good mentor who was my supervisor when I was doing my philosophy MA, and he sort of like got me woke to the reality of academia, because there's politics in terms of what we know as politics with a capital P, and then there's politics of being in a department, and there's people you have to appease and people you have to look out for, and like there's like any institution, including corporations, it's just monotony and it's Kafkaesque and it's like, oh my god. But it's that in any place, regardless of if you're a fascist or a communist, like you have to deal with that stuff, and you have to be prepared to sort of for lack of a better term, you know get shitted on and then say thank you for the hat. You know what I mean? And
right,
I
right.
think that there's a lot of practical things that people, I would say, I hate to say this, but people on the right can be very pigheaded about these things. And I think that you have to sort of bring yourself down to a level where there's an understanding. You have to sort of play the game. You have to go into it knowing that, you know, even when it comes to the monotony of being in a university department or being in a corporate job, it's like, you have to really deal with a lot of things like that. And I think, see, this is the problem. The problem is that people, whether you're on the far left or the far right, you want everything now. And again, would be even my criticism of the NRX people, is that you can't go from A to Z right away. You have to sort of realize your limitations and realize the situation that you're in and realizing the personalities that you're dealing with. And you can't just, go in and say you have to legitimize my idea because you're legitimizing the ideas of people I hate, and that's unfair. like, this language of being fair, it's like this fantasy, you know what I mean? And I'm sorry, I'm rambling right now.
No, no, I think you're right. And another interesting thing to note is that like the hospitality that the university provides to left wingers is ultimately, it really is a curse on left wingers, because it really does lead to their collective mental atrophy. And in some
Yeah,
sense,
city scholarship, yeah.
there's a reason why, some of the most kind of interesting, explosive, genuinely kind of novel and disruptive intellectual projects in the past few years have come from the right, like Nick Land and Moldbug, I think of in particular.
Right.
And there's a reason. There's a reason why there's not. I mean, it's hard for me to think of a kind of genuinely kind of novel, really dangerous, exciting, strange uh, kind of like shock from the left in that regard that would
Yeah.
be comparable. And that makes perfect sense. Why? Because if you're on the left and you're intelligent, you can, you're relatively more likely to make a comfortable home in some sort of, institutionalized cathedral kind of
Oregon.
social space. And all that does is lull you into a lamer mode of thought and a lamer orientation to the world, a lamer and lazier, kind of self-satisfaction. And it ultimately, what it does in the long run is it makes the collective output of like left intellectual content dumber and lazier, and it forces people on the right to be more creative and to be more daring,
Better, yeah.
and to do things like organically through their own like creative, making their own like creative platforms or whatever. And I think that's what you're seeing right now. That's why, like, people are so interested in people like Nick Land and Moldbug. All I'm getting at is that in some sense, it's easy to think, or it's easy to talk as if like, the left wing bias of the cultural institutions, call it the cathedral or whatever you want, is this kind of like really suppressive, unfair force,
Right.
making like the right suffer and marginalized. But it's not at all clear that that's actually the long run effect. It might actually be a boon to the intellectual energy of the right in the long run. And who knows what's going to replace the university. I mean, from the inside, to be honest, I feel like I think about this every day. I feel this every day in the university. I feel like we really are in like the latest stages of higher education as we know it, because it's so bloated with all kinds of lies and disingenuous attitudes and behaviors. It really feels like kind of like late stage Soviet collective delusion in so many
Yeah,
ways.
the decadence of it, yeah.
Yeah, that I'm kind of like, I'm constantly looking around to me, like looking around, like, is this real? How long could this possibly last? And whatever comes after, it might very well not have a left wing bias. Like left wing culture right now is in pretty dire straits in terms of like
It's
the public backlash, and people are really kind of getting smart to a lot of it. So yeah,
yeah,
this is kind of
dominant cathedral operation, yeah.
yeah, that was just a bit of a rant to say that, it might look like left wingers and left wing ideas have this kind of like easy life and are promoted and everything like that, but it's
But
not at
no,
all it's not at all clear like what the long run implications of that are actually going to be.
and I would argue that, and first of all, I 100% agree with, and this is an absolute fire take that you've just made. 100% agree. I would also argue that in a way, like, okay, we could say like being a bug man is almost like soul crushing because you're beholden to institutions and people and discourses that are very almost inhuman in a way. And I would say that I would argue that not only does it make leftist scholarship very banal and lackadaisical and nonsensical, but I would say that unfortunately it opens up the left to the cathedral institutions that will swallow it whole and make people tools of the very enemies of the left that used to be the enemies of the left. Like you mentioned how there's no genuine grassroots or niche uprising of energy and manifestations of discourses on the left. And I would say that the last time you saw that was in the 90s. You had David Graeber and the anti-globalization movement and direct sociology and things like that, where academics were getting pelted with bottles and piss jugs in these protests. But nowadays we don't see that, because I would say that it's fair. It's a fair assessment that a lot of sort of discourses and intellectual work and even practical activism has been swallowed up by the corporatocracy, to the point where the HR departments are dictating policy because it's easy, because it's easier for a corporation to adopt this sort of the whole like woke political platform than it is to fundamentally change the way people do business and economics to begin with. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of even people on the left are starting to realize this, that if you get complacent, if you get lazy, if you work for institutions and foundations that guarantee you a livelihood, that you're going to become the things that you didn't want to become, because you're going to become a tool of power ultimately at the end of the day. Like, I'm very much a Foucauldian in that sense. Like, power is omnipotent, it's everywhere. And the fact that a lot of these people that work in institutions and write for these publications, they believe that because they've adopted a certain political platform, that they're somehow immune from the machinations of power. That's ridiculous to me.
Oh yeah, no. Like the left, like basic kind of tenets of left-wing kind of thought right now are completely continuous with the upper echelons of, university admin, for instance, like in higher ed. Like if you come into university as an academic and you're like a radical left protester type or whatever, you kind of imagine that you're like a rebel and a radical, and like the higher ups, the suits are
It's nice
kind of like
to create student protests. Yeah.
are like, yeah, you think the higher ups are like oppressive corporate business people who are trying to like oppress your like radical emancipatory ideas. But you quickly learn that actually all of the higher ups also have, very humane kind of quite left wing ideas, and they and basically everything that you think and want to do with students or whatever is like more or less what they want to do also. And you see that especially clearly with like this language around, preventing trauma and the
Yes. Yeah.
compassion towards students, and the trigger warnings, these sorts of things. Like that's a very clear and direct kind of continuity between, like radical activists, like on the streets, like people I would have known from Occupy or whatever, like anarchists, and like literally like administrators at my university that wear suits. It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's pretty funny. Yeah.
My personal take on like the Jordan Peterson pronoun thing, like I me personally, if I do get accepted into a PhD program, I'm cautiously scared, so I'm gonna go along with it. I think that you could say, okay, what Jordan Peterson did was brave and all that, and it's the way they criminalize language is wrong. But it's like the guy lectured at fucking Harvard. He had tenure. It's like a lot of these people that take that example, it's almost dangerous in a way, because if you're not in that position, then it's very hard to sort of challenge orthodoxy. And that leads to your point, which is the economic model of the university system itself is being increasingly called into question each semester. And who knows the way um, sort of alternative parallel discourses and institutions outside of that system, outside of that cathedral system, who knows, like, in a way it's exciting, but it's almost as if the problem is always going to be the problem of economics and funding, and the fact that the universities can rest on their laurels of legitimacy and things like that. And so as of late, it seems that the university system will be here for quite some time, but you see the fractures and the cracks, and the way that people are getting fed up with not just like the left wing shit. Okay, that's, we talk about the bias, but like you said, even the banality of like actually operating an institution and like dealing with all that stuff, it's like it's insane. Like, for example, I was reading this paper about MFA programs.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah, of course, right? The writers stuff, how the majority of it is funded by people who graduate and become professors who write books that only other MFA students read. And so it's like this little circular insulated economy of, like, buy my overpriced book because one day you'll get the privilege of lecturing and then you get to tell students to buy your overpriced book. And it's not a very sustainable, practical model of the way things are, the way things operate. And but my problem, of course, we talk about the problem with academia, but what I notice is that the problem I have is I don't want to go too far into that, because then you get this very, like, you know, hackneyed libertarianism where it's like, well, if it doesn't produce a physical thing, then it's not worthy of being funded. Let's fund business schools and STEM fields, and even STEM students are having a problem now finding meaningful employment. But I get the criticism of the system, but I still find a immense value in the classic humanities. And I think this whole attitude that especially people on the right have, that, oh, just let the institution burn, and because it doesn't produce anything, it quote unquote does not produce things, even though it clearly does. I think that attitude is equally wrong, but there are problems with the system that unfortunately can become fatal over time, as you've highlighted. So, yeah, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, it's interesting. I'm just thinking, yeah, that's all very rich. I mean, I'm just thinking like this is only tangentially related, but I was thinking about how the technology systems that universities use. Like, I don't know what your experience has been as a student, but
Oh,
if you become an academic and you kind of like have to operate the administrative systems a bit, it's one thing that is really clear. It becomes very clear is how insulated from competition, like the entire university system
yeah,
is.
yes,
It is a massive rent seeking kind of like space. It's all about kind of keeping out market competition. And
oh,
there are some, I think, legitimate humanistic reasons for making that argument, except that like you're not actually like keeping out um, anti-intellectual market forces. You're milking them for all they're worth, but
yeah, yeah, exactly.
only a small number of people get to milk them for all they're worth, and everyone else is kept out. So like that's what I think is like so kind of it's almost like a little bit more. It actually feels a little bit more evil than a traditional business. Like a traditional corporation just says like, hey, we're going to exploit this thing. We're going to create value out of that exploitation, and we're going to sell it. And
Exactly, yeah,
it's not necessarily pretty. We're not necessarily good people. We're not necessarily doing some public service. We're just going to apply a process to exploit something and make money off of it. And that's what we are. That's what a business is. But a university says that they're going to create a space that serves higher purposes than businesses, and that because of that, they need to insulate it from market competition, because if it was subject to market competition, then it would just be another vulgar business and they wouldn't be able to achieve their higher goals.
yes, exactly.
But what actually happens is once the university becomes insulated from market competitions, what actually happens is a small number of actors get to economically exploit the available resources in a very, and as much a commercial and ugly, vulgar, exploitative way as any business would, but even more horrifically, because they're not
Yeah,
actually forced. They're not actually forced to do it in a fairly functional way. And this is why I was mentioning the example of the technological systems, like the administrative databases and stuff that you have to run as an academic. It's horrifying because they basically don't work. Like they really don't work. They're constantly breaking. And another thing is they're constantly being replaced like every single year, it seems, every other year maybe. Like one of the basic systems that a university lecturer uses in the UK to, let's say, like, just take a random example, like the database that holds students' marks or whatever, and you transport marks from like Blackboard into this like centralized database, and then that's used to distribute the letters to students or whatever, like the marks database, just as one random example. Like the actual software that is used to do that is literally like overhauled every other year by like a new contractor doing like a new database interface system or whatever. And every time it's like really, really crappy. Like I use a lot of computers and I do a little bit of programming myself. So I have a pretty good sense of, the state of the art at different times. And it's like the average administrative like database interface that an academic uses, especially in the UK, that's what I know most about. I kid you not, like a 15-year-old kid in Silicon Valley could do a better job in a weekend. I'm not
my God.
like seriously, like the stuff that we're using, it looks like it's like from the age of AOL or something like that.
Web 1.1, yeah.
And even when like it's realized, okay, the system is like really not working, it makes no sense. We need to upgrade the system, and they'll fund a major initiative to change the system. It's the same type of like AOL level technology that looks horrible, it makes no sense. The user interface makes no sense, and it always leads to some like constant serious breakages, even when they try to fix the systems. And it's like, okay, you could hire people who know how to do this. Like they're not hard to find. And it's actually fairly affordable nowadays. Like the price of these sorts of things has been plummeting for years. Like there is no excuse for a university that has all of this money incoming from student loans, to have these like persistently broken old school technological systems. But there is one explanation. There's only one explanation I can think of, and I haven't studied this. Like one could do some really interesting like actual research, which I haven't done. But I see no other explanation than it's basically some sort of like cartel behavior where like the people, the contractors, the educational like technology contractors are just like the buddies with like the university presidents or whatever. So all the contracts are given to this like insulated set of contractors or something. That's the only hypothesis I can come up with. Or it's just maybe there's like fairly open and fair bidding, but the universities are so insulated from competition that there's really no incentive or pressure for them to pay what would be necessary for like a really functioning system. And they, so it's just a funny example.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Like to sort of press back from my whole anti-capitalist thing, I think that the universities do need a form of healthy competition. Like I remember when I was an undergrad, we had to apply for courses around like July, I think, and the system would just like crash, and they had to get a queue system, but that didn't work, so you waited for 3 hours, and it's ridiculous. And I think that I get their fear of competition, but at the same time, like universities are highly corporatized institutions to begin with. Like the whole thing that the corporations are going to take over the universities. The corporations, they already took over the universities through, backhanded means, but you know, it's almost like there's the worst of both worlds. It's like the private people talk about the private prison system in the United States. It's not truly private. It's like the costs are privatized, but the risk and the damage and the hardship is like brought to the level of government. It's truly like such a rent-seeking, decrepit, nasty institution because you end up getting the worst of both realities. And when it comes to university, my problem is that the students are going to get fucked over in the end anyways, and for academics like that truly do try to reach out to students and help them, it's like it's bad because it's almost like that whole administrative apparatus is like a Damocles held to your head, and I've been through it as a TA even. Like I try to help students, but my university was fairly accommodating, but sometimes you try to help people and you try to go the extra mile and you end up paying the price for it, right? So,
Yeah. So what else, dude? What else is on your mind? Someone in the chat just reprimanded me for talking so long. They want to hear you pontificate.
Oh, no problem. I like talking to you. What else is on my mind?
Any big projects in the future coming up that you're thinking about?
Well, I have a few commissions that I've completed and I'm starting to work on that you can find on my Instagram.
That's cool. You got a lot of commissions. That's nice.
Yeah, I get a fair amount. I have a few pieces that became like really popular on Twitter. Like, for example, my Shrek fedora, my modernist Shrek fedora thing became like, I've seen that everywhere. I've even seen that on like Reddit and 4chan.
Oh, did you like invent that?
Yeah, well, no, I didn't invent the Shrek fedora thing, but I did a painting of like a Shrek fedora that's like in the modern abstract impressionist style. So other than that, I'm trying to write a piece that I could submit to a journal that will sort of further a lot of the stuff I did in Foucault. But other than that, I'm just trying to grind out. I'm trying to write more essays to you know semi sort of serious academic essays. But in that, I'm trying to just get back to a lot of the stuff I was interested in years ago with art and aesthetics, because for a long time I solely focused on politics, and that could be sort of soul destroying after a while. So
Hmm.
I'm trying to write more about uh, a lot about art and aesthetic theory and art criticism and things like that. So, and in the blog, I recently started my own personal blog that's linked up, and that's really given me the freedom to do a lot of shorter pieces, because even though we're not getting paid, there's still a process of editing when it comes to submitting to like fringo publications. There's still like a guideline, right? So
Hmm.
I've been freed up more to write shorter pieces, to write a lot of like more fan service things, so
Cool.
that's yeah.
I didn't even ask you, like, what would your PhD be about?
If I were to pursue one, I would probably stick to political science.
Oh,
My
interesting.
Yeah, my PhD would more likely in political theory be about probably furthering a lot of the stuff I did with Michel Foucault, and possibly like alternative political movements in the age of the internet.
Dude, you should be a PhD student of Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I know, eh? But I don't have a psychology degree.
Dude,
Um,
he wouldn't care, man. Just say you're into like young and you want to like. I feel like if you actually,
I
I
was
want.
listen. I was into Young before Jordan Peterson was cool. Okay,
Dude, there you
I
go,
was
man. Dude,
I was like,
how funny would that be if you became his PhD student and you're like studying Jung and Foucault?
oh my god, that would blow people's minds.
I sort of wonder if, like, since he's so famous now, if he gets a shitload of like PhD applicants, like right wingers, kind of like you, who are kind of like trying to move into academia. They're all wanting
Oh,
to study with him.
oh, no doubt. Like, of course, you got to pay like $200 to talk to him. So, oh God, yeah. So I would probably focus on alternative political movements in the age of the internet, because I did quite a bit of work with like Deleuze and Guattari and things like that, and but for the past few years, my focus has been on the middle to late periods of Michel Foucault, and I actually wrote this piece for Thermidor. Oh my god, I can't believe my supervisor let me do it, because it was a
What's it called?
it was called the Foucauldian Cathedral,
Hmm.
and you can't find it now because Thermidor got nuked. But I
Oh,
will.
they took all their stuff down.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm going to probably post it on my academia edu page.
Okay, so tell us the argument or the idea.
Well, basically, it was a appendix to my major research paper, and it was comparing uh, the sort of like non-centralized discursive idea of Moldbug's cathedral with the way Foucault approaches power. And of
Hmm.
course, I did other essays before where I talk about Foucault and conspiracy theories, how the twain shall not meet.
Hmm. Well,
But
there's even an academic little subfield about how Foucault is like a closet conservative. Do you know that stuff?
yeah, well, I when I did my research for MRP, like I was reading what's that guy's name who wrote about Foucault and neoliberalism?
I think Foucault 2.0, isn't that the book?
Yeah. The guy is called Zamora, something like that. Zamora. He wrote Foucault and neoliberalism. Yeah, that's a growing field of interest where, like especially around Foucault's lectures at the Collège de France, and I believe Society Must Be Defended, where he has a very like favorable view of Friedrich Hayek. But what I try
Right, right.
yeah, but what I want to make explicit is that when I was doing my MRP, I tried to stay away from those type of conclusions, to like, because it's very grating to people, and it's sort of like not not that it's not appropriate, but I certainly don't feel that Foucault was a quote unquote conservative. I think that the stuff in the 80s that people like uh what's her name? She wrote that essay, Foucault the Young Conservative.
Hmm.
Um
I don't know.
Fraser, she wrote that book about
Oh, okay.
yeah. Nancy Fraser. I can't
Mhm.
believe I forgot that. She wrote this very influential essay that I was sort of commenting on, that examines the ways that Foucault, through his anti-humanism, through his critiques of power, and how he wasn't very he didn't have like a sort of condemnation of power itself, how Foucault in a way was kind of like a quote unquote young conservative on the level of like Heidegger and Schmidt. And of course, the original critique came from Habermas. Habermas thought that Foucault was like this conservative radical, like Heidegger and Schmidt and Carlyle. And of course, Nancy Fraser at the end concludes that he wasn't. But I was trying to say, well, there's some stuff to suggest that maybe he's more sympathetic to the right than what a lot of people in critical theory would want him to be, especially like the gender theorists and people like that. So
Yeah, yeah. This also connects to what like Nick Land thinks about Gilles Deleuze, which is that he's basically a kind of like closet anti-leftist. Um,
ooh, interesting.
yeah, well, I at first I thought that was kind of preposterous, but the more I, the more I thought about it, the more I think it kind of makes sense. And I now kind of connected to Foucault because I'm a big fan of Foucault and Deleuze. And I think that kind of you can understand both of them as I think they have a lot of leftist sympathies, but you can
No
see them.
doubt.
But I think like what you can see them as doing is basically trying to marshal the resources and the prestige of kind of like radical left theory, but basically kind of save it from some of its own like stupidity. So
Yeah,
like
yeah,
you
true.
know, yeah. So it's like it kind of makes sense. Like if you're an intellectual in France in like the at that time period, um, it's the milieu, like it just is the intellectual milieu. There's a certain language game that you're playing, whether you like it or not. This goes back to kind of to our conversation before about
Right.
the leftism of academia. Like it's just a language game. Like yeah, maybe it's more hospitable to the left than it is to the right, but ultimately it is just a language game. And if you're smart, then you play the language game and you hack the language game to produce results that are more aligned with what you're thinking and feeling, and
Oh
what you're trying to get across. And I think that's kind of
my
what,
god, this
yeah.
is exactly. This is what I've been trying to say to people. But go ahead.
No, no, go on if you want to riff on that.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that there's, especially within postmodernist thought, and if you read people in the sort of radical orthodoxy tradition like John Milbank, like there's such a fertile set of tools. And if you look at it like a Deleuzian toolbox that the right can really benefit from. And when it comes to that milieu that Foucault and Deleuze were operating in, I mean, when Foucault critiqued orthodox Marxism and he saw that his great mentor Jean-Paul Sartre was kissing up to Chairman Mao, I mean that shit was scary. Like they took that very seriously back in the day when Foucault was at the Collège de France. Like that, you couldn't, like, people talk about persecution nowadays, but back then, like, you couldn't fuck around, like but
Hmm.
apart from that, like he would say things that would piss people off. Like he would say how the social security system and welfare is another extension of modern power that is often neglected, right? Um, but yeah, I would say that you have to approach these things with an open mind. And as much as I try to resist putting conclusions on these thinkers, because of course, I don't think any of us can match the genius of these people, as pretentious as it sounds. Um,
Hey, speak for yourself, man. I absolutely intend to match their genius, but go on.
yeah. I As much as eventually, the young lion has to overtake the Zen master, right? But no, I think well, again, another wrestling term, young lion. um I think I think that, yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on right now. And I think that as much as the sort of outrage culture on the left is very scary, especially like accusing people of certain things, uh I see that there's too much potential and that you shouldn't be worried about the risks, and that you have to be daring as a scholar to really go forth and carve your own path. I mean, I know this is just like lip service to what academics used to tell themselves, but there, and as cynical and as bitter as it sounds, because nowadays we've come to face with the reality of institutionalized academia. I think there's still that romanticism in being daring, and but I would say that to live outside of the norm, whether you are an artist or an academic, or someone who has a great idea and someone who wants to grade against power structures, I think we've sort of lost our capacity to realize that if you don't want to be a normie, if you don't want to be a quote unquote NPC, then there are consequences to that. Whether it's like being a NEET and living with your parents, or whether it's being shunned or being socially persecuted, I think that the price. Um, let me use a very cliche Krishnamurti quote. Uh, it is no sign of mental health to be well adjusted and live in a profoundly sick society. And I think more people have to realize that social alienation comes with being a person who grates with orthodoxy.
Hmm.
And again, this is why I say what you're doing is very quite brave, because you are and of course, you have your limits, as you've said. You're not gonna invite some fucking Nazi Groiper on, Nazi Groiper 1488, but what even this micro instance of communication between people who traditionally would never have talked to each other, like, I think this is one of the best conversations I've ever had personally. you know
Nice.
and I've had a lot of conversations with people, and I've had friends who are very far left, and I think that when we're daring enough to lift those barriers and to accept the consequences, good or bad, I think that is in those moments of uh, critical upsurging of intellect and creativity, and I would say the sort of the musing that comes when you deeply look into your own self and your own soul. I think those are the instances that have produced the great books, the great canons, the great art. And I know the more I ramble, the more I sound like sued. So I'm going to
No,
stop
no,
there.
no, it's good. It's all good. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think people like Foucault and Deleuze were quite oppressed by the increasing stupidity of the leftist milieu of their own time. And,
Yes.
they probably found academia and their milieu as annoying and stupid and
Yeah.
as repressive as, like the average like NRX blogger would find academia. But that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but they're like they're like, okay, this is what I'm given. This is the language game I have to play. Then how can I hack it to say something that I actually think is really interesting and useful, despite the constraints? Um, to be fair, I'm kind of ragging on like you know the NRX bloggers who I
Yeah.
do kind of tend to agree with you that I think a lot of kind of right wing intellectual people, especially young people who like are kind of debating whether or not they wanted to go into some sort of like mainstream intellectual route. I do agree with you that I think they are a little bit too paranoid, but I'm being a bit glib. Like I think it is actually university is like probably much more oppressive right now than it was for Deleuze and Foucault.
Yeah.
It is no doubt, but I think what you were speaking to is that it's a perennial dilemma basically, and
Exactly.
it's kind of intrinsic to the human condition in some sense that if what you want to do is radical intellectual work, you're signing up for a world of pain. I mean that's always how it's been. Yeah.
Well, I would even argue that even on the left, like people who are sort of outside the sphere of like Ide Paul and whatever is popular. Not, and again, like here's the thing. Okay, let me make one thing clear. Um, there's a lot of bad to Ide Paul identity politics, but I think that to use that term as sort of like a Sargonite slur, I think that's kind of like too on the nose. Like I think again, like I have sympathies for things like post-colonial theory and things like that. And I think that to just cast that shit aside is sort of being not sound intellectually. So I really, like for example, I no longer use the term cultural Marxist because I think that's kind of like a misnomer, right? Like, or what is Jordan Peterson? What does he call them? He calls them
Neo-Marxist?
postmodern neo-Marxist.
Neo-Marxist, yeah.
Even though like postmodernists have been, at the throats of Marxism since Foucault's time, right? So
Mm.
I think that even on the left, like if you are a genuine Marxist, if you are like a classical, like post Althusser Marxist, I think you even experience a level of alienation in academia nowadays, right? Whether or not, you may get by, but I think that there's
Yeah.
still ideological policing on the left as well, which I mean, and here's the thing, okay, here's the psychology of a right winger. Okay, it's a siege mentality can produce a lot of different ideational barriers to people's thinking because and it's true, you feel, and I would count myself among these ranks as well. You feel like you're persecuted, and you feel like you're left out, and you are. And the reality is that if you are a traditionalist in the modern world today, in hyper reality, you are going to suffer a level of alienation. But that being said, I think that a lot of right wingers, as much as I sympathize, I think that they can go a bit too far in sort of like, I'm going to be a totally radical, the 14 words and all that stuff. You know what I mean? I think that
Uh-huh.
you can't just respond with edginess alone. You have to be tactical. You have to realize that a siege mentality can play upon your thinking to the point where you're catastrophizing things. And the thing is, you have to really push back and say that, you know, if it's not just me as a person on the right who's going to be fucked by the cathedral. It's like almost everyone nowadays is sort of being, being mind fucked to a degree. I know I shouldn't swear, but you know what I mean. Like, it seems that everyone nowadays is experiencing a sort of metaphysical malaise or cancer that's polluting the airways. And I think that as things get more hostile and as people are actually sort of being ginned up into a level of bitterness and apathy, I think we're all going to experience something good or bad that's on the horizon. And, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know what's going to happen in the next election cycle. Um, it seems to me that even if dark times are ahead, we're all going to equally have to look inside of ourselves and make very dramatic decisions. You know what I mean? And yeah, so
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And also I think it's worth stressing that there are different games that you can play, I mean there really are, especially for like having a successful intellectual life. I mean, there are just many ways to do it. And
yeah, exactly.
I think like people have to, I feel like one of the things we're learning right now is that you have to be really insightful about your own strengths and weaknesses in general, like
Yes.
not even if for intellectuals, just generally across the economy, no matter what it is. It's like the people that are succeeding right now seem to be those who have an honest assessment of what they're good at and what they're not good at. And then they take the risks that are necessary to basically carve out a space in which they can just do what they're really good at and not have to do what they're really shit at. And it often means like you're going to look weird. You're kind of doing things. You're taking a weird path. It's not going to really map onto what other people's sense of like a trajectory should look like. And it might mean, yeah, it can look all kinds of weird. But my sense is that like those are the people who like kind of come out well today. And I think that the same thing applies to like the intellectual games. Like academia suits a certain type of temperament, a certain sort of personality traits.
Oh yeah.
Can do very well in academia. Certain personality traits you're not going to do well in academia just because the type of person that you are. But maybe you could be like a fucking mold bug, or who knows, or some other type. You can constitute an intellectual project through some other vector. And then there's a bunch of other like random things in between academia and the radical like independent blogger. There's like all these other possible pathways that have yet to even be invented yet. So it's like like YouTube, for instance. Like what the fuck is YouTube? Like it's still being decided. It's still being decided like what all of these different platforms can be and what can be constituted on them. So it's like it's hard because people want to go down paths that are like fairly reliable that have already been done. But I think like the way to go is to like just be radically honest about like what type of specific things are you really good at and what are you shit at, and just no matter how weird it is, just carve out, get the tools that you need to carve out a system that is going to let you go pedal to the metal on what it is you're actually good at and what you're actually motivated to do, and steer clear from what you're not. I mean, all the stuff I'm doing on YouTube and this stuff is kind of an example of what I'm talking about. Like, I'm a good academic, but I'm never going to be like a Steven Pinker type. Like, I'm just not. I learned that. Like, I kind of was aspiring to be like a Steven Pinker type of like, like social scientist type of trajectory. But I learned like over the past couple of years, I don't have the personality traits. Like, I'm not in the 99th percentile of, conscientiousness. I'm not, my IQ is not high enough really I'm not going to be a Nobel Prize winner. You know what I mean?
You're
But
gonna be a Rhodes Scholar or a Harvard graduate. Yeah.
but I have other things that like Steven Pinker doesn't have. Like I'm really high on the personality aspect, enthusiasm, which means I get,
That
which
was
means
just on my mind. It's like you actually have a personality.
well, that's kind of what I'm. That's kind of yeah. That's well. That's what kind of what I'm like. I'm really high on enthusiasm, for instance, like one of the aspects of extroversion. And what that means is that like if I'm interested in something, I can talk about it for hours at a time every day.
Yeah.
Not everyone can do that. So I'm like, okay, YouTube can let me do that. So maybe I'll start investing some of my energy into that and see what happens. It's like who knows what's going to come of any of this, but it's just an example of what I'm talking about. That like I feel like that's the way to go, and not really worry about like what you think you should be doing, but just basically go like iteratively push further down any possible opening in which you can do what you're really good at more explosively than you could the day before. That's how I see it anyway.
Like I 100% agree, and I think that like a lot of it does come down to your personality. It comes down to sort of like the sort of a millennial what do they call it, the gig economy, and the fact that you can, I believe, operate on an integral level that connects various parts into an individuated whole of what you're good at. Like, for example, I have many articles in everywhere I publish, with I think the exception of Thermidor, where I use my own art as a way of getting into my articles. Like, I think a lot of people have to do that instead of just relying on some illustrator, right? Like when it comes to institutions, as things change, other doors open up. And like, for example, you're always worried about applying to different places, but I have a friend who is, recently in the program in a Toronto university, and I won't name names, obviously, but he has that temperament of being an academic, I would say. He's got the very, mild, very like carefully writing sort of style that someone like me, it takes me an effort. Not takes me, that's tongue twister. It takes an effort on my part for me to write in that very concise academic style. Like I think I can do it, like not to toot my own horn, but it's difficult for me to like have a number of points and to not go off on a tangent, to not write like, because there's a difference between writing a very interesting article in a magazine that captivates people's attention, and, as you know, actually writing a journal article for a professional academic peer-reviewed publication, right?
Sure.
And so a lot of people, I feel, that are brilliant and have the capacity, they, for whatever reason, can't conform to that style of like mild mannerism that is required of you as an academic. And I often doubt myself. I I've gotten this far. I've have, 2 master's degrees, and I've come up with some troubles here and there. But, I feel that sometimes deep down when I look at it, I'm like, well, what should I do? And a lot of people feel that. A lot of people who have talents that aren't easily translatable into a monetary gain, whether it be a scholar, an artist, or whatnot, we're always going to feel that doubt. And I think the more you can branch off into other things, and the more you can sort of find different talents to become an integrated whole. I think that's very attractive later on in life. In It's very attractive in terms of actually carving out an alternative path or an alternative institution. And like this is the thing, like a lot of writers I notice, they have this like very, I don't want to use the term autistic because that's offensive, whatever, but let's just, for brevity's sake, let's call it this autistic mentality that it's like I have to write this very Baroquean long form essay, and it's like I can focus on nothing else. You know what I mean? But the reality is that you have to cultivate a unique personality, because this is what it largely is in the content game. You have to branch out into other things. You have to explore other avenues. But yeah. So end rant.
Yeah, no, definitely. Do you want to take a question real quick from the audience? There's one that came up a few minutes ago that I forgot to ask you. Do you know anything about the right-winger conspiracy of Peggy Guggenheim to utilize Duchamp to overthrow academic art?
I've heard of that. I'm not very convinced.
Okay.
um, like there's always these sort of conspiracies. Like for example, there's the one where John Lennon was a secret conservative and things like that.
Hey,
But
do you mind? Do you mind if I go get a glass of water and you can just continue talking to the audience? I'll be
yeah,
right
sure,
back.
no problem.
I'll be right back.
I can't see what they're writing, but
Oh no, just riff on that, or then
all
talk
right,
about
yeah.
whatever you feel like.
I think that when it comes to these conspiracies, when it comes to modern art, when it, I'm getting tongue tied here. I think that there's some evidence to suggest that maybe there's an underlying current there, but when it, the whole modern art scene in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was a lot of interesting things going on. For example, there's a lot of like underground things that people aren't aware of that, only later on people became, aware of. For example, the CIA, how they would use the abstract expressionists against Soviet realism, and how, given the context of another society, um, abstract expressionism and conceptualism and non-objective art is very socially subversive and very almost reactionary in a sense. But in the context of Western society, it's become very like bourgeois and orthodox and not very energetic as of late, because it relies on what's, the commonly held set of beliefs and discourses. But no, I was just talking about how modern art is different in the context of other societies and traditions. Like when the CIA tried to use the abstract expressionists against the Soviets, right?
Oh yeah, that was
Yeah,
true. That's true, right? That was real.
yeah. But like for example, here in the West, it's like modern art is viewed as very bourgeois and very orthodox in terms of the cathedral institutions. But in other societies, it was very subversive and almost reactionary in a sense.
Hmm.
Like there's this Chinese artist, for example. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he's the one that did that piece where he photographed himself smashing a 2,000-year-old pot.
Oh, Ai Weiwei.
Yeah, that guy. It's his art almost comes off, and I know this is a crazy claim, but his art almost comes off as reactionary in the sense that he is looking to the past and he wants to revive the traditions in China, but he's doing it in a way that people find very subversive and chic and modern art ish. And
Mhm.
I think, to me, that's so fascinating because it sort of dejects the concept that people have of the art world being this intensely progressive left wing thing where feminists like paint with period blood and things like that. But really, when it comes to other cultures in the world, like if you look at art scenes around the world, like it's almost the opposite. Like for example, all the great artists in Russia, they were almost like right wing, especially the writers. And so I think that this is a very interesting time we live in where we can reap the benefits as well, like not just experience the horrors of, but reap the benefits of globalization in terms of information, because now we can really look at what other people experience in terms of art and culture and politics, looking back at us, because it seems that people are very, I know this is like, years ago this would have been like a left-wing talking point, but years ago, oh fuck me, sorry, I'm getting distracted.
That's right.
Yeah, years ago this was the left-wing talking point, but it seems that we're very insular within the Western world and with the European slash North American way of viewing things, and it seems to me that it sort of robs us of the context of other people's. Like, of course, I'm a critic of, like in Canada, we have like state enforced multiculturalism and all that stuff. Like, I have my criticisms, but at the end of the day, I think that to know the other is ultimately beneficial. Of course, I don't think that Europe should be flooded with migrants or whatever, but I think that, sorry, you go ahead. You go ahead. I'm
No,
just
that's
getting
good.
caught up.
That's good. I was just thinking about how you are. I think you are definitely what we would call nice RX. Have you ever heard of that?
I've never heard of this. I've never heard of this.
Oh, I gotta connect you with John from Synanon. Have you ever seen him on Twitter?
I may have come across him. I may have.
Hashtag nice RX. It's kind of a funny idea that I've seen around, and I talked with John a little bit. It's basically like NRX but nice, and it's sort of self-explanatory. But I would say that from what I know of you now that we've talked at length, you definitely qualify for nice RX. You should search Twitter for nice RX and say hi.
Oh, I should. Maybe I should like switch to becoming a bloodthirsty absolutist. But no, yeah, yeah. Well, I think that as much as I certainly have a proclivity towards non-liberal, or should I say post-liberal political systems, and I think that a certain degree of authoritarianism is almost necessary. I don't know, like I'm not fully, you know what I mean? Like to me, it's like a cultural thing, like the whole like neo-monarchical ideals. But as a Catholic myself, but I don't know, like I really I don't share the same sentiment as a lot of NRX people that really buy wholesale into the neo-absolutist stuff. Like, I don't get me wrong, like I think that stuff is interesting. I'm not casting shade on people, but I think that there's a lot of criticisms of neo-reaction that are, like I've said earlier on, that you have to really formulate of how to achieve power, and the how is sort of missing in a lot of reactionary discourse, in my personal opinion, because it seems that we're coming up with these very ornate and Byzantine and intellectual political systems, but it's like, okay, how are we going to achieve that? And Mole Bug's thing is like, well, I like the idea of patchwork, obviously, but it's like, oh, well, we're gonna be these experts, and we're gonna, we're just so brilliant, and we're so euphoric that we're just gonna glide into these institutions, and they're gonna love us because of how great we are at being technocrats. You know what I mean? Like I'm not, I'm not trying to butcher Mold Bug, but it seems that there's not a lot of practical application in terms of political systems that get bandied about in reactionary circles. And
Right.
if any more Buggians listening, I'm not trying to criticize more. It's like I have my criticisms, but I'm trying to be as fair as possible. So yeah,
Well,
I'm gonna get flack for that, but
I don't know if you've seen what I've been writing about recently, but I'm kind of getting interested in feudalism as a model.
yeah,
So
yeah. I mean,
yeah, basically like small scale communitarian kind of manners in which it's basically communist in the sense that the productive people will guarantee like a dignified basic standard of living for everyone, as long as everyone abides by the rules, and if people like bad behaviors are strongly and draconianly punished. But everyone is basically guaranteed like a proper place in a society that they have deep belonging in, and
yes, yeah,
and yeah, it's like basically functional communism, a communist patch along the feudal lines. Like my argument is basically that European feudalism was basically the original patchwork, and
yes,
with Catholicism as the kind of like software basically that everyone shared, you can have this kind of like you can actually have an organic cultural whole that's economically productive, and where everyone is basically has a dignified life kind of guaranteed for them at a bare minimum at least, and there's not slaves, and they can potentially do other things if they want to, but there's coherence, there's redistribution, and there's like collective stability organized around like deeply shared beliefs. Like that, like feudalism basically does all of that. Now there were problems with it for sure, but my
Yes.
hypothesis is that if I think my wager is that you could harness the digital revolution to basically go back and reinvent the basically the feudal model in a way that solves the problems of yore, using like the digital solutions that are available to us now. That's kind of the idea that I'm interested in right now.
I 100% agree with that, and here's why. I am friends with and I have sympathy towards, and I think that if you're willing to do that, then do it. But like the anarcho-primitivists, the pine tree people,
Uh-huh.
uh, I I have my sympathies and I'm friends with them, but I'm not fully convinced totally on anarcho-primitivism as like a unitive political project. I think that as a patchwork, it's feasible, and of course, the more I research into feudalism, especially Catholic feudalism, I think that, as crazy as this sounds, but like you're saying, feudalism as a political model in our age could potentially make a comeback as a post-liberal ideology, at least in a patch. But my biggest thing is that you need to have a unity, or at least a partial unity, of culture and metaphysics and religion and philosophy. And
Mhm.
I think that in the absence of those things, the way that liberal society has sort of gutted us of these associations, you will find more people who will sort of want to drop out and say, well, this society, not only does it not give me meaning, but it's destroying the meaning that I have. And I think that this is why I'm not a white nationalist, because I think that the purely biological definition of race is sort of, what, to put it mildly, wholly inadequate in terms of the consciousness of being part of something greater than yourself in a community. I
Mhm.
think that, don't get me wrong, like race is obviously important, but it's not as important as like, your average white nationalist thinks it is. I think that, and people can say, oh well, you're cucking out and all this stuff, but no, it's true. Culture, and especially philosophy and religion that people share, I believe can overcome the just a purely biological notion of tribalism. And
Yeah.
even like national, like, see, the thing is, nationalism is a word that's bandied about carelessly, but really nationalism is just as much an invention of modernity the way we know as anything else. And you don't even have to read Bernard Anderson. Is it Bernard Anderson, or he wrote Imagine Communities?
Oh, Benedict Anderson.
Benedict Anderson, yeah. You don't like it's very true what he says, that nationalism, the way we conceive it, was largely a byproduct of print capital. And I think that,
Mhm.
there was much older versions of right-wing anti-nationalism that need to be explored. And I remember, like, a lot of authors at Thermidor, and particularly N.T. Carlsbad, like, he wrote about this stuff, about right-wing forms of anti-nationalism, because I think that this dichotomy that we have, it's sort of inadequate. That, well, I'm pro-nationalist, but the left is against nationalism. And yes, the left is internationalist, but we have to distinguish what is internationalism proper in terms of metaphysics, and what is this sort of profane globalist internationalism that we find among the various organs of the political left. And so, yeah, politics is strange, and I think people will eventually embrace the strangeness.
Well, I think you're definitely right that having a really satisfactory and functional society absolutely requires some sort of basis for attuning, the attentions and kind of value based reference points for the different people in it. And again, like I think that speaks in favor of how and why Catholicism is rationally adaptive. Like
Yes, very much so.
Catholicism did provide that in like a highly fragmented period in the Middle Ages, and um there are still a lot of Catholics out there. So there's no reason why Catholicism could not even currently be used as the kind of organizing principle of the successful communist patch. That this is kind of what I'm putting out. This is like what I'm trying to think through. Like,
I wonder if orthodoxy could be sort of similar. I would say so as well. That even orthodox.
sure, yeah, just for the same reason. And I would also second a point you made, which is that, well, I would make it. You gave me this thought, and it's a thought I've had before, and you basically were kind of getting at it, I thought, but I would just add it also, which is that, you know, another reason why Catholicism is very attractive and quite rational, I think. And I don't want to reduce like religion or Catholicism to these like instrumental calculations, because I don't.
Yes,
You
exactly.
can't
The
do that.
Stefan Molyneux thing. I hate that.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you can't do that, and I totally get that. But when when a worldview happens to have positive effects, it can be registered as a data point in your larger assessment of what is true. So, I would never say, believe in the Catholic God, because if you do, you get these like good things.
Yeah, you
That
get
completely
the
misses the
invisible
point.
backpack of goodies. Yeah.
Yeah, that completely misses the point. But I do think it's rational to say, if religion seems to have some strange, a whole bunch of surprisingly positive implications that happen to come from it, that it's definitely reasonable as a Bayesian that you would enter that data into your database and say, okay, this is going to increase my estimated probability that this religion is true. I mean, I think that's reasonable. So that's all I'm really saying. But that's an aside. One example of this kind of reflection is that religion, I think, is a much better alternative for finding social and cultural coherence than race.
Yeah.
And it's like if you are if you're like a rational, educated Sam Harris kind of like skeptical atheist, but you also are horrified by white nationalism and white racism, and you know you really want you really don't want to see white racism kind of become like the culturally organizing principle for atomized white people in the West.
Yeah.
well
Where it's
then well then you
where
better be really interested in what is going to be like the coherent organizing cultural principle of atomized white people in the West, because it sure as hell isn't going to be like skeptical atheism. Like that doesn't make that's not going to give that's good for rootless cosmopolitans, like in a
yeah.
game of like status seeking, but it's just it never has and it never will give like organization and alignment and calibration to like deep, to an actual community of people to find belonging and meaning in the long term. And so it's like,
100% agree. Like,
yeah, so I feel like Catholicism is like, pretty cool, or religion more generally, I would even say is pretty cool, especially if you're worried about things like white nationalism, I think.
yeah, it's not so much. In some sense, I am worried. Like, I think that when it comes to like actual unironic racism, like that's something I don't really, like, because I've studied other cultures and things like. Not, I'm not trying to sound like a quote unquote cuck here, but I think unironic racism is something we should avoid, obviously, and I think that when it comes to to cast shade on certain people, when it comes to what a lot of these like more popular white nationalists say about society, like they'll do things like they'll try to like adopt American republicanism, which like it's not going to work. Or like if you like actually listen to what they say in terms of like what a quote unquote ethno state will be, they're like we used to use this term racist liberal, because like that's what they are, a lot of them, where they're like, well, we're going to have like liberal society and you get to do all your degenerate stuff, but only white people get to do it. It's like, damn, that's it's just like it's almost like they want to be just as rootless as any bugman in a major city, and they, certain people, and I don't have to name names, like they want to attend wine and cheese parties, but it's like they want a white version of that. They want like white hipsterism, you know what I mean? Like, and to me, it's just it shows that people, especially young people, who grow up in a profoundly broken and a profoundly alienating society. And like, let's face it, when it comes to being like a young white male, I would argue that yeah, you do suffer a degree of discrimination. You know what I mean? Like I think that popular culture does sort of view you as quote unquote the enemy. But that being said, it's like they're impressionable people want to find a quick solution, and I don't think that obsessing over biological race is will mend the damage that has been done to the human soul and the human psyche inflicted upon it by modernity. And
No.
so
Yeah,
if
not
I'm
at
a
all.
cuck in that regard, then I'm a cuck. I'm not a cuck, but you know what I mean. Like,
No, I don't think it's being a cuck. I agree with you that I genuinely don't think race solves that problem. And I also think that even if it did, that's a losing game plan, man. In the end, that's going to be really bad for everyone, I think, personally. So
yeah.
uh, that's like to me relatively obvious reasons why I'm not into like white people shit personally.
Well, hey, like 90% of my political enemies are pretty much white. I know, like, oh, I know that people are gonna say, "What about the Jews?" You know, but I don't want to touch that stuff personally. But yeah, but let's just say that a lot of my political enemies, upwards of 80% on the far left, like 9 times out of 10, end up being white. So, like, you know, I don't think race is like this ideology shield that like race can sort of cover you from being like either like quote unquote degenerate, or being like someone that doesn't inculcate quote unquote white interests. You know what I mean? Like I just also have a problem with the whole pan whiteism or pan European thing. I don't think that there's any personally, I don't think that there's any historical basis for that type of thinking. Like it's very much a product of like American thought, because it's like in America everyone's a mutt, you know what I mean? So but in Europe I don't think, like, even among the new droit, the European new right, a lot of those thinkers I don't think fit that definition of quote unquote pan-European white nationalists. So yeah.
So people in the chat are kind of asking me about this, so I'll talk a little bit more about it. Like I
Yeah,
think
go ahead.
I just don't think that biological race matters that much, to be honest. I think that the variation in people's like ethical qualities that I actually do care the most about, and that actually do make the most that do have the most significant effect for functional and meaningful and desirable community belonging, are they're just not mostly correlated with biological race. So for instance, like this is why I think religion is a much superior kind of like principle for alignment than race is. Because if I think about, like, if I was going to start like a patch, like a new kind of country or something like that, some new mini state, if I had like one principle of selection, just think about this, like really think this through, people. Like if you could only select the people you're going to do that with on one principle, and then it's random after that principle. So for instance, if you say you want to make a new country all with white people, then that you can say that, and then you're going to get a random draw of 50 white people who are United States citizens, let's say, just to fix ideas. That's one possibility. Or you can specify a religion, or you can specify some other dimension. Um, you know,
Yeah.
like every day of the week, I'm going to choose Catholicism over whiteness because
Over
because
white people, yeah, yeah.
just because like there's so much variation in whiteness. Like there are lots of really really shitty white people that I wouldn't really want to have anything to do with.
Oh, ton,
And
ton.
but I actually do think that like of like all the Catholic people in the world, like there's a much high, like they're not perfect at all, but there's a much higher probability that they're going to have like high ethical standards and certain ideas and expectations that I tend to share and that I think are important for like functional life. And so like I would much sooner start a new, like enter into some sort of like community based on the single dimension of Catholicism way sooner than I would ever want to do that on race, because I just don't think race is that predictive. I don't think it's that biologically significant. So that's my personal like concrete explanation of like why I'm not interested in like race personally.
Like I think that um this sort of like trend of like white nationalism and race realism, it's even dangerous to people on the right, not in like the whole like, oh, because of racism thing, like the media response to it, but it's dangerous because it really to me smacks of like 20th century or 19th, 20th century like positivism that is just as much corrosive to like faith and metaphysics as anything else. Like how can you explain that like a lot of like white nationalists are just like straight up atheists, like who's like the French Canadian guy, Jeff Garepi, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, not to cast shade on him. Like, I think he does a lot of good in his show, whatever. But to me, it just seems that if you, it's such a positivistic model. It's like the current obsession with like IQ and race. Like, here's the thing, okay? I believe that you should have academic freedom, and I believe that people that do that research, that there's something to it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, uh, I wouldn't. I would caution against saying that there's a correlation not just of IQ and race, but therefore IQ, race, and criminality. Like, yeah, you could say the FBI crime statistic. Well, it's a meme, right? The FBI crime statistics. But I would say that someone in Africa who is a person of faith who loves their family but doesn't have the IQ of like an Anglo-Saxon, you know, to me it's like I don't find that offensive. That it's like I personally believe in the theory that like there's many different forms of IQ, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
you can be intelligent doing a skill and sensing an environment the way a bushcraft person would, and
Mhm.
like you can have a lay of the land, but you're not like big brain in terms of like you have like what is a high IQ, like 130, 140 IQ, you know what I mean? Like I just don't see how. I think IQ is important. Obviously, it would be ridiculous to not think it's just doesn't matter. But the obsession over it and the whole politics behind it, it's just to me. I think it's very limiting. It's very like 19th century positivism. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And also, again, like another reason why Catholicism is awesome is because if you really think that IQ differences are like a major social political problem or threat, or there's something really dangerous about that, well, then guess what is really great? A philosophy that says all people have intrinsically equal human dignity. It's like that,
yeah,
like that's one reason why I'm just like not at all bothered by any of the IQ research or, the HBD stuff.
yeah.
I don't find it that like problematic because I genuinely believe all people, have a spark of divinity and are radically equal in their basic human worth. They might have total different, like major differences in aptitudes and all different kinds of things, but those are relatively superficial differences compared to like the radical cosmic equality that I deeply believe in. But that's why, like, I think secular, like the people who are so bent out of shape about like IQ differences and the discourses on that, the people that are so sensitive to that politically are people who don't believe in God generally. So they don't
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
they actually don't believe in the radical cosmic equality of all beings.
So they need a profane secular form of degenerated equality. Like, here's the
Yeah.
thing. I believe that we all have that spark of divinity and we are equal in the eyes of God, but I don't necessarily believe in egalitarianism as a political project. Like, I mean, obviously, like I'm on the political right, I believe in hierarchy, but I think that, what really turned me off to this way of thinking was the example of like as a Catholic, even when I wasn't a Catholic, I'm open to admitting this, whether I get the consequences from it or not. But I'm a very like pro-life person. You know what I mean? Like I
Mhm.
truly believe in the Jean Paul II concept of the culture of life.
Mhm.
Maybe with the exception of the death penalty, like that can be debated. But like when I read this article, I think it was in like it must have been like one of these like Radex journal types where it's like about how you know the pro-life people are cocks because abortion's good as long as black people are being aborted. Like to me is it can lead to a very monstrous way of viewing the world, in my opinion. And I'm not saying this like the way that the mainstream media, like, uh, treats these white nationalists, because I think that that's bullshit way of doing it too. But when you start talking about like you know how like abortion is for minorities and things like that, it's like, to me, I can't possibly be on board with that shit. You know what I mean? Like that's such a terrible way of viewing humanity. You know what I mean? Especially when it comes to the unborn. So that's my personal take on it.
Yeah, I hear that. I might just let that be the last word because I feel like I'm starting to run out of steam. My sentences are becoming a little choppy, and we have done more than 2 hours now. So
Holy shit! Really?
yeah, time
Oh
flies.
man. I think because we sort of clicked, we're sort of like,
Yeah, this was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it too. So thank you very much.
yeah. And let me just say, last word. Shout out to my buddies in the Clamatorium, by the way. That's a little group that I'm part of. Uh,
What is
you
that?
know, oh, it's a Discord group. It's
Nice.
esoteric. But let me say a shout out to all my friends on Twitter. Um, I'm not going to name names, but there are some people that sort of caution me. They're like, "Oh yeah, that Justin Murphy just wants attention. He's like an academic infiltrator and all this shit."
Huh.
But let me just say final word. I love what you're doing. I love this talk we've had. What you're doing is great, and hopefully maybe we can talk in the future. And everyone follow me on Twitter at Giant Geo, all one word, no capital on Twitter. Thank you very much, my friend.
There you go. Great. That was awesome. Yeah, your Twitter handle and all that is in the description, so people can find that. That's funny that your crew had some fighting words for me. I always find it strange, like how many people on the internet like have picked beef with me. Like I don't,
I know. Yeah.
I really don't get it. But I'm not sensitive to it. But I appreciate that you wanted to have this conversation with me, even despite the better judgment of your friend group.
Let me just say you're not a Fed, so people don't worry. Justin Murphy isn't a Fed, so
I'm not a Fed. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. If people actually really think that, I sometimes can't tell if people really think stuff or they just like, kind of imagining. It's like a conspiracy theory type of thinking.
I think we're
Um,
all pretty much Feds nowadays. So,
what? Yeah, right. I wonder if this conversation will change the minds of some of your peers.
oh, hopefully.
Oh, I should also say to you, Gio, that you haven't been following the public chat, have you? Um,
No, I haven't.
there's been a fair amount of love in here for you that you might not have gotten to see, and
Oh, wow.
you probably won't want to watch it all back. So I'm just telling you now, like someone said that, oh, they didn't know that you wrote the Foucauldian Cathedral, and they said they really liked that. And
Ah,
someone also said at some point, a few people said some quite nice things about the conversation, and there were some other nice things about you. You might want to look up. And sorry, people, we didn't get to answer all of your questions. This always happens. Like people often ask a lot of questions towards the end when things are starting to get tired and kind of got to wrap things up. That's when a lot of questions come. So sorry if I didn't get to your question, but
ask me on Twitter. Ask me on
yeah,
Twitter.
there you
Yeah.
go. If you have other questions, you can ask Gio on Twitter. Gio's clearly a very nice person. He's a nice RX, so you can
Thank you. Yeah.
send him questions on Twitter if you want to. But yeah, thanks for everyone in the chat. Thanks for hanging out. It's been real. I also, by the way, have for anyone watching this who's maybe new to my stuff, I also run a little Discord server. So if you're interested in these types of topics and you don't have enough people to talk about it with, the rule is you have to shoot me a DM on Twitter, and then I'll give you the secret initiation process. For anyone out there listening who's interested, just hit me up on Twitter if you want to get in the Discord. And yeah. Oh, Michael says that he thinks you're really cute, Gio.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Gio, thank you. You're a very nice man, and this has been like a very interesting and fun and relaxed, friendly, but also very intellectually stimulating exchange that we've had, and it's been cool to grok a little bit better like what you're all about and your kind of position in the larger like weird Twitter space and where you kind of come down politically on different topics. So it's good to get a better
Great.
sense. It's good to get a better sense of like who you are and what you think and all of that.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
See you later, dude. Talk to you
See
next
ya.
time. All right, everyone. I'm very tired now. That was fun. I'm gonna stop the broadcast now. Thank you for hanging out. I'm always very grateful. Remember that I'll be doing another live stream on Friday night. I'm going to be talking with communists, real hardcore communists from the Swamp Side chats. This is the person who wrote the recent takedown article on accelerationism. So yeah, we're going to be talking about all of that. That'll be around the same time, Friday night. Oh, see, my light just went out automatically. All right, thanks for hanging out, everyone. Talk to you next time. Later.